The Plague of Justinian. The first pandemic, from of the plague. The arrival of the plague. The 6th century was a time of both ambition and turmoil. For the Byzantine Empire, which had emerged as a successor to the Roman Empire, this era seemed to hold great promise under Emperor Justinian I. Justinian, a determined and often ruthless ruler, sought to restore the glory of the Roman Empire through military conquests, ambitious construction projects, and legal reforms. His vision, however, would soon collide with a force beyond his control. In the year 5041, a silent visitor arrived at the shores of the Byzantine Empire, a visitor that would change the course of history forever. This was the Plague of Justinian, named after the emperor who ruled during its catastrophic wave. Little did anyone know at the time, but this disease would reverberate through history, creating a pattern of pandemics that would become a recurring theme in the centuries to come. The plague's origins are debated among historians, but it's widely believed to have started in the steppes of Central Asia. From there, it travelled along the trade routes, carried by merchants and soldiers, until it reached the great city of Constantinople. It is estimated that at its peak, this plague killed as much as half of the population of the Byzantine Empire, though exact numbers are lost to time. But how did this epidemic unfold, and what made it so uniquely devastating? The answer lies in the microscopic workings of the Yersinia pestis bacteria, the pathogen responsible for both bubonic and pneumonic plague. For most of history, these diseases spread through fleas, living on rats. The Byzantine Empire, much like other empires of the time, was connected by vast trade networks, routes that helped spread not only goods but also diseases. The densely populated city of Constantinople became the perfect breeding ground for such a pestilence. As the first reports of illness surfaced in Constantinople, they were initially dismissed as minor outbreaks. It wasn't until the disease reached critical mass, with entire neighborhoods falling silent as bodies piled up, that the full scale of the disaster became apparent. By the time the emperor's officials realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late to stop the spread. The Plague of Justinian was a terrifying force. The first symptoms appeared swiftly: fever, chills, fatigue, and swollen, painful lymph nodes that formed buboes. The disease spread rapidly, often claiming lives in a matter of days. Its reach extended far beyond Constantinople, spreading through the Mediterranean and reaching places as distant as Gaul, modern-day France, Egypt, and even North Africa. But the effects of the plague were not only biological, it was also a test of the resilience of the Byzantine people and their emperor. As death spread through Constantinople, so too did panic. Shops closed, businesses ground to a halt, and the streets emptied. The vibrant city, which had been bustling with merchants, artists, and politicians, fell silent under the weight of the invisible enemy. In the midst of this chaos, Emperor Justinian tried to maintain order, but as the plague spread, the ability of the government to function was severely compromised. Much of the administration collapsed, and even the emperor himself fell ill at one point. Whether he contracted the disease or not is unclear, but it is said that Justinian's close advisors were deeply concerned that he might not survive the outbreak. What made this plague so devastating, though, was not just the immediate toll it took. The long-term effects would prove even more profound. As the epidemic swept through the empire, it decimated the workforce, leaving the empire struggling to maintain its agricultural output. Crop production faltered, food became scarce, and famine followed. Trade routes were disrupted, and the once thriving economy of Constantinople was severely impacted. The aftermath and its impact, as the plague of Justinian continued to ravage the Byzantine Empire, the full scope of its devastation became apparent, not just in the death toll, but in the social, political, and economic fabric of the empire itself. What had once been a prosperous and powerful empire began to feel the effects of this unprecedented crisis in ways that would leave lasting marks on history. The disease continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world, and its waves came and went over the next several decades, receding at times only to return with renewed strength. As many as 25 million people across the Byzantine Empire and beyond may have succumbed to the plague. While these numbers are difficult to verify, they paint a sobering picture of the scale of the disaster. It is estimated that the city of Constantinople, which had boasted a population of around 500,000 people before the outbreak, saw its population reduced by as much as 40 to 50% during the worst of the epidemic. For an empire whose strength lay in its cities, particularly its capital, this was a significant blow. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the plague reshaped Byzantine society in numerous ways. One of the most significant impacts was on the labor force. With so many people dying, entire professions were left vacant. Farms, workshops, and markets struggled to stay open. The empire's military campaigns also suffered as soldiers, unable to replace those lost, were forced to abandon their positions or were too sick to continue fighting. The plague made it almost impossible for the empire to maintain its expansive borders or pursue its military ambitions with the same fervor as before. At the heart of this economic collapse was the disruption of trade. The Mediterranean, a vast network of commerce connecting the east and west, was rendered chaotic. Ports that had once been bustling with merchants transporting goods across continents were abandoned. The outbreak not only made travel dangerous, but it also severely limited the movement of goods. Constantinople, a critical center for trade, now found itself isolated, unable to sustain its wealth or influence. For those who did survive, the aftermath of the plague was just as traumatic. The very social structure of the Byzantine world began to unravel. The upper classes, who had once been secure in their wealth and power, now had to contend with the effects of their own fragility. The rich were no longer immune from suffering. The nobility, once accustomed to living in relative isolation from the lower layers, found that no amount of wealth or privilege could keep them safe from the unseen enemy. This breakdown of the social order caused a shift in attitudes, creating space for new social dynamics. Religious practices also saw a significant transformation in response to the plague. The devastating loss of life and the seemingly random nature of the disease led many to question the will of God. The Byzantine Empire had long been a bastion of Christianity, but the horror of the plague tested the faith of even the most devout. Church leaders, however, sought to provide solace, preaching about the plague as divine punishment, a reminder of humanity's sinfulness, or as a test of faith. The monasteries became places of refuge for the sick, though their efforts could not halt the spread of the disease. In addition to religious and social upheaval, the plague had a profound political effect. Justinian, who had once been a symbol of imperial strength and ambition, now found himself in a position of vulnerability. His desire to restore the Roman Empire and expand its territories became increasingly difficult as resources dwindled and his military forces were weakened. The ambitious military campaigns that had defined his rule were severely impacted. The reconquest of North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, which had been a major goal of Justinian's reign, now faced serious setbacks. Despite his initial success in these campaigns, the plague significantly delayed his plans, and in some cases brought them to a halt. Yet in the midst of all this suffering and hardship, the plague also prompted unexpected changes in the empire's administrative structures. The population decline led to a scarcity of labor, which meant that many landowners could no longer rely on the same labor force they once had. This, in turn, led to changes in the way estates were managed. Large landholders, particularly in the rural provinces, began to rely more heavily on smaller, tenant-based agricultural systems, as fewer people were available to work the land. This shift in agricultural practices would have long-term effects on the Byzantine economy. But what is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the plague's legacy is its connection to the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire. Historians often point to the impact of the plague of Justinian as a critical turning point in the history of the empire. Though the empire would continue to exist for several more centuries, the plague left deep scars. The economic and social structures that had supported the empire began to fray, and while Justinian's successors would attempt to rebuild, they would never fully recover from the devastation. The Byzantines, for all their resilience, could not prevent the empire's slow descent into a weakened state. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the empire faced further challenges: Arab invasions, the rise of new powers in the west, and the loss of crucial territories that were once the core of its strength. In many ways, the plague of Justinian marked the beginning of the Byzantine Empire's long struggle to maintain its power in a rapidly changing world. As the centuries passed, historians would come to see the plague of Justinian as not just a medical catastrophe, but a pivotal moment in the long saga of the Byzantine Empire. It was a reminder of how fragile human civilizations can be in the face of invisible unstoppable forces. The empire's ability to endure through such a calamity speaks to the resilience of its people. But one must wonder, could the empire have avoided the worst effects of the plague if its leaders had acted differently? Could there have been a way to slow the plague's spread, or even prevent it entirely? The long-term legacy of the plague. As the plague of Justinian began to subside, the Byzantine Empire faced a world fundamentally altered. The disease had not only taken a devastating toll on the population, but had also reshaped the political, social, and economic landscape in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. In the wake of such widespread destruction, the question became, what would remain of the empire once the shadow of the plague lifted? Though the initial devastation was clear, the long-term consequences of the plague of Justinian were far more subtle and complex. For many historians, it is impossible to fully comprehend the enduring effects of the pandemic without considering the way it changed the trajectory of not just the Byzantine Empire but the entire medieval world. The empire would survive for nearly another 900 years, but the seeds of its eventual decline were sown in the years following the plague. One of the most profound impacts of the plague was on the empire's ability to defend its borders. The military campaigns of Justinian, once a cornerstone of his reign, came to a grinding halt. His efforts to reclaim the lost western territories of the Roman Empire, particularly in Italy, North Africa, and Spain, suffered due to the plague's disruption of manpower. Despite initial success in these reconquests, the Byzantines were unable to consolidate control over these territories after the plague's ravages. By the time the 7th century arrived, the empire was beset by new challenges that further drained its resources. One of the most significant was the rise of Islam and the rapid expansion of the Arab caliphates. While the Byzantines had once been a dominant force in the Mediterranean, their military and political clout had been severely diminished by the plague. With a weakened army and an overstretched empire, the Byzantines were unable to stop the rapid spread of Islam, which would eventually lead to the loss of vast swaths of territory in the Middle East and North Africa. In addition to the external threats, the internal political structure of the Byzantine Empire also began to fray. The empire had long relied on a complex system of administration, with local governors managing different provinces and answering directly to the emperor in Constantinople. But the plague had disrupted this network. Fewer people were available to fill positions of power, and the economic strain made it increasingly difficult for the central government to maintain control over distant provinces. The loss of administrative cohesion led to a gradual decentralization of power, a problem that would plague the empire for centuries. The economic impact of the plague also cannot be overstated. For the Byzantine Empire, a city like Constantinople had been the heart of a vast trade network, drawing goods from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. With the loss of life and the disruption of trade, the city's economic system collapsed. The once thriving marketplace was now a shadow of its former self. The silver coinage that had been the foundation of the Byzantine economy began to lose value, and the empire was forced to rely more heavily on barter and localized trade. Yet, despite these profound setbacks, the empire did not simply collapse. In fact, the resilience of the Byzantine people during this time is often understated. While much of the empire's grandeur began to slip away, the Byzantines did not entirely give in to the weight of history. Though their military and economic power were significantly reduced, the Byzantine Empire managed to maintain a core identity, largely due to its centralized system of governance and the tenacity of its ruling class. The art, culture, and religion of the Byzantine Empire also experienced an evolution following the plague. The empire, which had long been a center of Christian scholarship, witnessed a renewed interest in theological and philosophical debates, particularly surrounding the nature of divine intervention in the plague. Religious leaders and theologians pondered the meaning of such a catastrophic event, leading to a new focus on monasticism and spiritual contemplation as responses to the suffering. The plague of Justinian also had a unique impact on the Christian Church. With the large-scale deaths of clergy members and monks, the Church faced a crisis of leadership. Yet in many ways this forced the Church to adapt and innovate. New religious practices and rituals emerged as a response to the overwhelming despair caused by the plague. This period saw the beginning of certain monastic reforms, the spread of pilgrimage practices, and a growing devotion to saints as intercessors. As the empire limped into the 8th and 9th centuries, the Byzantines continued to grapple with the consequences of the plague. Some historians argue that the Byzantine Empire never fully recovered from the demographic losses, and its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 was in part a culmination of the long-term effects of the plague of Justinian. While the empire would continue to survive in various forms, its peak had passed. But the legacy of the plague of Justinian extends beyond the Byzantine Empire. The disease had reverberations throughout the Mediterranean world, affecting neighboring societies such as the Sasanian Empire in Persia, the early Islamic caliphates, and even regions as far away as Europe. It set a precedent for future pandemics, including the Black Death of the 14th century, which would strike Europe with even more ferocity. The same bacterium that caused Justinian's plague would later be responsible for the death of 1/3 of Europe's population in the 1300s, a stark reminder of the devastating potential of pandemics. In the modern world, the plague of Justinian is often viewed through the lens of public health. The lessons it imparted about the spread of infectious diseases, the importance of quarantine, and the limits of medical knowledge are as relevant today as they were in the 6th century. With each new pandemic, from the Spanish flu of 1918 to COVID-19 in the 21st century, society finds itself facing many of the same challenges the Byzantines encountered centuries ago. The plague of Justinian was, in essence, a reminder of how fragile human civilization can be in the face of disease. It was a force that reshaped the world, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to echo through time. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, would continue to survive for several centuries, but the global consequences of the plague were undeniable. And the question remains, what lessons can we, in our own time, draw from the struggles of the past? Will we be better prepared to face the next wave of global pandemics, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes that empires like Byzantium made so many centuries ago? The long walk to Runnymede, the unlikely origins of Magna Carta, the seeds of rebellion. In the early 13th century, England found itself under the rule of a king whose reign would forever change the course of history. King John, often remembered for his lack of military success and poor leadership, would become the central figure in one of the most important documents ever to emerge from the English monarchy, the Magna Carta. But before the famous signing of this document in 1215, there were years of growing tension, conflict, and simmering resentment that would lead to one of the most unlikely and perhaps most significant rebellions in English history. John was born in 1166 to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, two of the most powerful and influential figures of the medieval world. Despite being the youngest of his siblings, John was positioned to inherit significant territories. However, his path to the throne was not a smooth one. After the death of his older brother, Richard the Lionheart, John succeeded him as king in 1199. Though not without controversy. Richard had been one of England's most celebrated monarchs, known for his valour during the Third Crusade and his ability to rally the English people in times of war. However, Richard left the throne under less than favourable circumstances. He spent much of his reign abroad, leaving John to handle affairs in England. Though John had been made Lord of Ireland and had significant responsibilities, he was seen as an ineffective and at times vindictive ruler. As soon as he ascended the throne, his mismanagement and lack of regard for his subjects became apparent. John's reign was marked by a series of poor decisions that alienated both the nobility and the common people. One of the most disastrous was his failure to manage England's relationship with France. England at this time controlled vast territories in France, and the kings of England were known for their significant holdings on the continent. However, John's repeated military failures in France led to the loss of these territories, most notably the Duchy of Normandy. These losses were deeply felt by the English nobility, who had enjoyed the wealth and influence that came with their lands in France. To make matters worse, John's reign was also marred by his heavy taxation of the nobility and the common people, his need for funds to support his failed military campaigns in France, and his general inability to manage the crown's finances led to widespread discontent. King John imposed taxes not only on the barons, but also on the church, which was a deeply unpopular move. In the early 13th century, the church held significant influence, and its leaders were often viewed as a counterbalance to royal power. John's disregard for the church's authority and his attempts to control its wealth and land only served to deepen the divide between him and his subjects. It was not only the nobility who resented John, however. The common people too felt the weight of his rule. John's government was characterized by arbitrary decisions, heavy taxation, and the king's frequent demands for military service. The English people were also subjected to a system of royal justice that was often exploitative. The king had the power to seize land, impose fines, and demand fealty at his will. This sense of insecurity and fear of the king's whims contributed to an atmosphere ripe for rebellion. One of the key moments that would eventually spark the movement towards Magna Carta occurred in 1209, when John became involved in a bitter dispute with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. The appointment of Langton, a man who had the support of the Pope, was strongly opposed by King John. John's refusal to accept Langton's appointment caused the Pope to place England under an interdict, a form of religious excommunication that suspended many religious practices, including the celebration of Mass. This act further eroded John's authority, as it alienated a large portion of his subjects, who were deeply devout and viewed the church as a central institution in their lives. In retaliation, John seized the lands and wealth of the church, which angered not only the clergy but also the barons, many of whom were closely tied to the church and its vast holdings. This growing tension between the king and his nobility would prove to be the tipping point. By 1213, the situation had reached a boiling point. The barons, who had long been resentful of John's rule, began to unite against him. They were not just concerned with the heavy taxes and the loss of their lands, but also with the arbitrary nature of John's rule. The king's behavior had undermined the feudal system, which had been built on a balance of power between the monarchy and the nobility. This delicate system, where land and power were exchanged in return for loyalty and military service, had been disrupted by John's increasing authoritarianism. In response, the barons began to secretly meet and plot against the king. They sought a way to curb John's power and restore some degree of balance to the political system. While this rebellion was initially driven by the immediate concerns of the barons, it soon became clear that the forces at work were much larger than any single faction. But how did it come to pass that these barons, once loyal to the king, would demand such sweeping changes? What was it that pushed them to seek a formal declaration of rights and protections for all of England's subjects, from the nobility to the common people? The path to Runnymede was set in motion by not just anger, but a deep and growing sense of injustice. The barons, through their efforts, would soon find themselves fighting not only for their own interests, but for a document that would define the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects for centuries to come. Would the barons succeed in their rebellion? Would King John concede to their demands, or would this conflict erupt into a civil war? The gathering storm. By 1214, the situation in England had reached a crisis point. King John, once a seemingly secure monarch, now faced mounting pressure from all sides. The barons, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with his reign, were no longer simply seeking redress for their personal grievances. They were now organizing in earnest, determined to secure a fundamental shift in the power dynamics between the king and his nobles. John's previous military failures, notably the disastrous loss of Normandy to the French King Philip II, had further undermined his credibility. His inability to protect English territories in France made him appear weak, and his kingdom, once seen as a powerful and dominant force in Europe, was increasingly viewed as vulnerable. The barons, many of whom had invested heavily in the defense of these territories, saw their investments crumble under John's leadership. These losses were not just military defeats. They represented the erosion of wealth and influence that the barons had worked for generations to build. In response to these setbacks, John resorted to even more aggressive taxation. In 1214, he raised money by imposing heavy fines and demanding increased military service from the barons. John's decisions were driven by his desperation for funds to rebuild his military forces, but they only served to further alienate the nobility. It became increasingly clear that the king was more concerned with maintaining his personal power than with safeguarding the welfare of his subjects. At the same time, John's conflict with the church remained unresolved. His excommunication and the interdict imposed by Pope Innocent III had continued to weigh heavily on his reign. By this point, the English people were growing weary of his disregard for the church's authority. His actions had not only damaged his relationship with the clergy, but had also left the kingdom in a state of spiritual unrest. The people of England, already suffering from the economic strain caused by the king's policies, now found themselves living under the shadow of religious turmoil. It was a situation that only added to the general sense of dissatisfaction with John's rule. Amidst this mounting unrest, the barons took decisive action. They issued a list of demands, a set of rights that they believed would curb the king's powers and ensure that he could no longer govern as an absolute monarch. These demands were not revolutionary in the sense of advocating for democracy or equality, but they sought to establish a system of governance in which the king would be bound by law and his powers would be limited by a council of nobles. The barons wanted to ensure that no ruler could ever again wield unchecked authority over the land and its people. The barons' grievances were collected and formalized into a document that would later be known as the Magna Carta. This document outlined specific freedoms and protections for the barons, the church, and the people of England. It demanded that the king cease his arbitrary actions, reduce taxes, and respect the rights of free men. But perhaps most importantly, it established the principle that even the king was not above the law. In the spring of 1215, tensions reached a boiling point. The barons, emboldened by their growing numbers and the support of influential figures, such as Archbishop Langton, took matters into their own hands. They formally rebelled against King John, capturing London and securing control of key areas in the North and Midlands. John, realizing that his authority was being challenged in a way he had never experienced before, had no choice but to come to terms with the barons. But even as the barons gained the upper hand, King John remained resolute in his refusal to concede to their demands. He knew that the consequences of granting the barons the power to limit his authority would be far-reaching. In his view, it would mean the collapse of the monarchy itself. He was determined not to be outmaneuvered, and he sought to maintain his control over the kingdom at any cost. Yet, despite his opposition, the growing pressure on him forced John to the negotiating table. In June 1215, both sides agreed to meet at Runnymede, a meadow by the River Thames, to discuss the terms of a settlement. The location, neutral and easily accessible, was symbolic of the shifting power dynamics in England. Runnymede would become the site of one of the most famous moments in English history. As King John arrived at Runnymede, he was accompanied by a large retinue of advisors, knights, and loyalists. The barons, too, came prepared, bringing their own supporters to the gathering. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of history. The two sides were bitterly divided, yet both knew that the consequences of failure could be disastrous. The barons were determined to secure their rights, while John was desperate to preserve his throne. At the heart of the discussions was the Magna Carta, the document that would define the terms of the settlement. The king, though resistant to its contents, found himself with few options. The barons had the upper hand, and the fate of his reign hung in the balance. Over the course of several days, the document was debated, modified, and ultimately agreed upon. On June 15, 1215, King John reluctantly affixed his seal to the Magna Carta, signing it into law. The Magna Carta was not a perfect document. It was a compromise born out of necessity rather than idealism. Many of its provisions were specific to the barons, granting them certain protections and rights that had previously been denied. It called for a fairer system of taxation, restrictions on arbitrary imprisonment, and a greater role for the nobility in governing the realm. It also established the principle that the king could not levy taxes without the consent of the realm's council, a significant step in limiting royal power. However, the Magna Carta was not the end of the story. King John never truly accepted the document, and his reign continued to be marked by conflict with the barons. In fact, within months of signing the Magna Carta, John sought to annul the agreement, and the kingdom was plunged into civil war. Yet, despite the immediate failure of the Magna Carta to bring peace, its legacy would endure. The Magna Carta, though a product of rebellion, planted the seeds of constitutional law in England. Its principles, particularly the idea that no one, not even the king, was above the law, would resonate through the centuries. While the document itself was revised and reissued several times in the years following its signing, it became a symbol of the struggle for freedom and justice, influencing not only England, but also the development of democratic principles worldwide. Would the Magna Carta truly limit the power of the monarchy? Could it be the beginning of a new era of governance in England? Or was it just a temporary setback in John's pursuit of absolute power? The legacy of Magna Carta. The signing of Magna Carta on June 15, 1215, marked the culmination of a period of intense political and social conflict in England. But while the document's immediate effect was limited, its legacy would be far-reaching. Magna Carta was not just a temporary resolution to a moment of crisis. It became a foundational document in the development of constitutional law, influencing the course of English history and the wider world for centuries to come. In the short term, the Magna Carta did not bring the peace the barons had hoped for. King John's signature on the document was hardly an act of genuine submission. He saw it as a forced concession, born of necessity rather than belief. Within weeks, John sought to nullify the agreement, appealing to Pope Innocent III, who promptly declared the Magna Carta void. This action led to a renewed conflict between the king and the barons, resulting in civil war, known as the First Barons. Despite the king's attempts to rescind the document, the barons had already gained a crucial victory. They had forced John to acknowledge the principle that the king's power was not absolute, and that his actions could be held to account by law. The First Barons' War was a tumultuous period, with constant fighting and shifting allegiances. However, in 1216, King John died unexpectedly, leaving his young son Henry III to inherit the throne. Henry's regency was marked by continued instability, but it was also the moment when the principles of Magna Carta began to take root more firmly within English governance. The barons, still holding to the principles established in the document, began to push for its reissue under the new king. In 1216, just months after John's death, Magna Carta was reissued by Henry III's regents, with certain clauses modified to suit the circumstances of the time. Over the next several decades, the document would be reissued in various forms, gradually becoming part of English law. The Magna Carta, though originally designed to curtail the power of one king, became a symbol of the broader struggle for legal rights and limitations on monarchical authority. As the 13th century progressed, the political landscape of England began to evolve. The barons' demands for limits on the king's power laid the groundwork for the development of parliamentary governance. In the decades that followed, the English monarchy would continue to wrestle with the tension between royal authority and the rights of the nobility. This tension would be a key feature of English politics throughout the medieval period, ultimately leading to the establishment of the English Parliament, which took shape during the reign of Edward I in the late 13th century. The Magna Carta also had a profound impact on the development of legal principles. Many of the clauses in the document dealt with the protection of property, the fair treatment of free men, and the limitation of excessive taxation. The idea that the king could not levy taxes without the consent of his council was a radical departure from the past, and would become a cornerstone of constitutional principles in later centuries. The document also established the idea of due process of law, ensuring that no one could be imprisoned or stripped of their property without a fair trial. While Magna Carta was initially a product of the feudal system, its principles gradually evolved into something more universal. Over time, the document came to symbolize the protection of individual rights and freedoms, regardless of one's social class. The idea that power must be exercised within the constraints of law rather than by the whims of a ruler was an enduring legacy of Magna Carta. In the centuries that followed, Magna Carta became an inspiration for various movements advocating for civil liberties and the rule of law. Its influence extended beyond England to other parts of the world. For example, during the 17th century, the English Parliament invoked Magna Carta as a justification for its struggle against the absolute power of the monarch. The English Civil War, 1642–1651, was partially driven by a desire to restore the principles of Magna Carta, as Parliament sought to limit the powers of King Charles. The eventual execution of Charles I and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell was in part a realization of the ideals expressed in Magna Carta. The document's impact also reached across the Atlantic. The American colonists, in their own struggle for independence from Britain, looked to Magna Carta as a symbol of their desire for a government bound by law. The principles enshrined in Magna Carta laid the foundation for the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The idea that the government must be accountable to the people, and that no one, not even a king or president, is above the law, became central tenets of American democracy. But the significance of Magna Carta was not just in its legal or political impact, it was also in the spirit it represented. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people, of barons and clergy, coming together to challenge a king's arbitrary rule. It was a reminder that even in a world where power was often wielded by force and birthright, the principles of justice, fairness, and accountability could be asserted. Magna Carta became a symbol of hope for those who sought to curtail the arbitrary exercise of power and protect their rights against tyrannical rulers. In a broader sense, Magna Carta embodies the idea that history is shaped not just by the actions of great kings and rulers, but by the struggles of ordinary people, whose collective action can lead to monumental change. The legacy of Magna Carta is a story of resilience, of people standing up for their rights, and of the slow but steady evolution of political and legal systems toward fairness and justice. And yet, even today, as we reflect on the principles established by the Magna Carta, we must ask, how far have we come in ensuring that the rights of individuals are protected in the face of power? What lessons does Magna Carta offer us in an age when new forms of government and new challenges to human rights emerge? How do we ensure that the ideals of justice and fairness, which began so long ago in the meadows of Runnymede, continue to resonate in the modern world? The Forgotten Emperor. The life of Emperor Michael VIII, Palaiologos. The rise of Michael VIII. The Byzantine Empire, long a beacon of civilization and political power in the eastern Mediterranean, had been in decline for centuries by the time the 13th century arrived. Its borders were shrinking, and the once great city of Constantinople, the heart of the empire, had fallen to the Fourth Crusade. For the next 57 years, the city remained under the control of Western Crusaders, who established the Latin Empire, a foreign and hostile force in a city that had long been the seat of Byzantine power. The true heirs of the Byzantine Empire, known as the Empire of Nicaea, operated from the nearby city of Nicaea, in Asia Minor. In this period of uncertainty and struggle, the fate of the Byzantine Empire seemed grim. The Latin Empire was seen as an overwhelming force, and the restoration of the Byzantine Empire appeared unlikely. Yet, in the year 1259, an individual emerged from the ashes of this fragmented empire, who would change the course of its history. Michael VIII Palaiologos, born in 1224, came from a noble family that had long served the Byzantine Empire. However, his rise to power would be anything but ordinary. Born into a time of instability, Michael's early life was shaped by the Byzantine struggle to maintain its independence against the Latin Crusaders and the expanding forces of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The young Michael was well aware of the state of his empire. Its once mighty influence had been replaced by a fragile hope of resurgence. He first gained prominence in the service of the Emperor John III Doukas Vatatzes, the ruler of the Empire of Nicaea, who was known for his wisdom and ability to hold together the remnants of the Byzantine state. Michael served in the Nicaean court and proved himself to be both a capable military leader and a skilled diplomat. He gained favor among the Nicaean nobles and the emperor himself, and this was crucial in establishing his future ambitions. Michael VIII's path to the throne was not a straightforward one. As his rise continued, he became increasingly involved in the politics and military campaigns of his time. The key turning point in his ascent occurred in 1259, when he played a critical role in the decisive Battle of Pelagonia, where the Nicaean forces, alongside their allies, defeated the Latin Empire's forces. This victory was a major step towards reclaiming Constantinople, but it also set in motion a series of events that would ultimately result in Michael's own rise to the throne of the restored Byzantine Empire. In 1261, Michael VIII seized upon an opportunity that would make him one of the most consequential Byzantine emperors of the later years. The Latin Empire was weakened by internal strife, and its rulers were distracted by external pressures. At this critical moment, Michael launched a daring military campaign to retake Constantinople, a task that many thought impossible. In a surprise move, his forces entered the city, which had been under Latin control for more than half a century, and expelled the Crusader rulers. On July 25, 1291, Michael VIII Palaiologos officially reclaimed the capital of the Byzantine Empire. His entry into Constantinople was celebrated as a restoration of the Byzantine Empire. The city, once again under the control of the rightful heirs of its ancient glory, saw Michael as the man who had restored its fortunes. The emperor's success in regaining the city from the Latin Crusaders was seen as a remarkable feat of military strategy and diplomacy. But while the recapture of Constantinople was a great victory, Michael's challenges were far from over. The Latin Empire's demise, though a triumph for Michael, left a power vacuum in the eastern Mediterranean. this vacuum would not remain unchallenged. The surrounding states, particularly the rising power of the Ottoman Turks, were poised to take advantage of any weakness in the newly restored Byzantine Empire. Michael VIII faced not only the challenge of consolidating his control over Constantinople, but also the daunting task of preserving the empire against these external threats. What then was the true cost of Michael's dramatic recovery of Constantinople? Was his victory as complete as it appeared, or were there hidden dangers that would undermine his rule in the years to come? The challenges of rule and the price of restoration. Michael VIII Palaiologos had succeeded in one of the most remarkable feats in Byzantine history, the recapture of Constantinople. His triumph was celebrated by many as the restoration of the Byzantine Empire, but it also marked the beginning of a series of challenges that would test his leadership and ultimately determine the fate of the empire he fought to restore. Upon regaining Constantinople, Michael VIII quickly moved to solidify his power and re-establish imperial authority over the formerly Latin-controlled territories. The Latin Empire had fragmented in the wake of its fall, and while it was no longer a cohesive force, the surrounding powers, including the various Latin principalities and the ambitious rise of the Ottoman Turks, were eager to fill the vacuum. Michael's first task was to reassert his rule within the city itself. The Latin occupation had transformed Constantinople both physically and culturally, and the city was now a shadow of its former self. Many of the ancient Byzantine structures had fallen into disrepair, and the Latin settlers had left their mark on the city's infrastructure. One of Michael's early challenges was re-establishing a sense of Byzantine identity. The Latin period had introduced a foreign system of rule, and many of the Byzantine citizens had spent decades under Latin domination. The emotional and cultural toll on the population was significant, and Michael's initial actions aimed at restoring Byzantine traditions and securing loyalty from his people. His efforts to restore the Greek Orthodox Church to its former place of prominence were key to this process. As the church had been at the heart of Byzantine identity for centuries, Michael worked diligently to reinstate the clergy and reclaim properties that had been seized by the Latin Church. Yet, this was only the beginning of his struggle to regain the trust of his people. Though Michael VIII's control of Constantinople was relatively unchallenged at first, his reign faced immediate internal difficulties. The Byzantines had not forgotten the decades of turmoil under the Latin Empire, and many doubted whether Michael could truly restore the empire's former glory. The nobility and military leaders were uncertain about his ability to secure peace and stability, especially in light of the threats from the west and east. The rival empires, particularly the rising power of the Ottoman Turks, loomed on the horizon, and the Byzantine Empire was far from being in a position to defend itself against such external threats. One of the major external issues Michael faced was his relationship with the Western powers. After the fall of the Latin Empire, there were hopes that the Byzantine Empire could rekindle its alliances with the West, particularly the papacy. During the reign of Michael's predecessor, Emperor John III Durkas Vatatis, there had been ongoing negotiations for a potential union between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. This union, which had long been a contentious issue between East and West, would have significantly altered the religious and political landscape of the Byzantine Empire. Michael VIII, however, had a different approach. He recognized that securing the throne of Constantinople depended not only on military might but also on diplomacy. In a move that would forever shape his reign, Michael decided to take a controversial step. He agreed to a formal union between the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches in 1274, known as the Union of Lions. The union was intended to secure papal support for the Byzantine Empire, but it was a deeply divisive act. While Michael hoped that the union would bring financial and military aid from the West, particularly from Pope Gregory X, the reality was far different. The agreement angered many of the Byzantine people who saw it as a betrayal of their long-held religious traditions. The Eastern Orthodox clergy, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, vehemently opposed the union, and protests broke out across the empire. Michael, in an effort to avoid rebellion, had to implement the union with minimal public support, and it was clear that his decision had caused a deep rift within the Byzantine Church. While he had hoped that the Pope would provide military aid to defend Constantinople from its enemies, this hope was never fully realized. The West remained largely uninterested in providing the support he had hoped for, and Michael was left with the difficult task of navigating the complex political landscape without the assistance he needed. At the same time, Michael's reign faced increasing pressure from the Ottoman Turks, who were gradually encroaching on Byzantine territory in Anatolia. The Ottoman Empire, though still in its early stages, was expanding rapidly under its leader, Osman. The Byzantine Empire, now weakened by internal divisions and external pressures, found itself increasingly unable to fend off the advancing Turks. By the late 13th century, the Ottoman Turks had established a foothold in the Balkans, and the Byzantine Empire's future looked uncertain. Michael VIII's reign was also marred by the challenges of internal dissent. His decision to marry his daughter Anne of Byzantium to the King of France was seen by some as a step towards securing Western alliances. However, this marriage, along with his dealings with the papacy, created tensions within the Byzantine nobility, who saw Michael as being too willing to compromise the empire's independence for the sake of short-term gains. His alliance with France and his efforts to secure the throne of Constantinople at any cost alienated many factions within the empire, and his reign became increasingly unpopular with the very elites he had hoped to unite. Despite these challenges, Michael VIII's determination to preserve the Byzantine Empire remained unwavering. He understood that the empire was in a state of near-permanent crisis, beset by both internal and external forces. Yet his rule became a symbol of the Byzantine resilience, as he fought to keep the empire afloat, even as it became clear that its survival was uncertain. His diplomatic maneuvers, though controversial, kept the empire on the map and delayed its eventual fall, but they also showed the limits of Byzantine power in the face of relentless external threats. The question remains, could Michael VIII have done more to secure the future of the empire? Was his diplomatic compromise with the West a necessary step for survival, or did it merely delay the inevitable? Could he have found a better balance between appeasing the West and maintaining the traditional power structure within the empire? Would the Byzantines have been better off if Michael had focused entirely on strengthening their internal unity and resisted the influence of the West? The fall of the empire, and Michael's legacy. The reign of Michael VIII's Palaiologos is often viewed with a certain irony. A man who fought so hard to restore the Byzantine Empire, only to see it teeter on the brink of destruction during his later years and beyond. His legacy is complex, defined by both his impressive restoration of Constantinople and the long-term challenges he could not fully overcome. By the time of Michael's death in 1282, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. While he had successfully retaken Constantinople from the Latin Empire and re-established the Byzantine throne, the empire had become increasingly vulnerable due to a series of both internal and external factors. These pressures would become even more apparent in the years following his death. One of Michael's most significant challenges was the continued encroachment of the Ottoman Turks. Even in his lifetime, the Ottoman Empire had begun to expand rapidly, particularly in the regions of Asia Minor and the Balkans, where the Byzantine Empire still held a fragile grip on its territories. Although Michael VIII made some attempts to resist the Turkish advance, he was ultimately unsuccessful in securing a long-term defense against their rising power. His military strategies, while occasionally effective, were not enough to stave off the growing threat. The Ottomans, led by Osman I and his successors, were steadily gaining strength. They established a firm foothold in Anatolia, and their expansion into the Balkans threatened the very heart of the Byzantine Empire. Michael VIII had also failed to sufficiently bolster the empire's military capabilities after recapturing Constantinople. The Byzantine army, once formidable, had been hollowed out during the years of Latin rule and the subsequent decline of the Byzantine state. Michael's reliance on diplomacy and temporary alliances with the West, rather than internal military rebuilding, ultimately left the empire too weak to defend itself from the Ottoman threat. Furthermore, the internal political divisions that had plagued Michael's reign worsened after his death. The empire remained riven by factionalism, with various factions vying for power. Michael had made enemies during his rule, especially among the nobility who resented his compromises with the West and his increasingly autocratic style. These divisions further weakened the internal cohesion of the empire, making it even more difficult to confront external threats. After Michael's death, his son Andronicus II inherited the throne. Unfortunately for the Byzantines, Andronicus II lacked his father's military prowess and diplomatic acumen, and under his rule the empire would see further losses of territory, particularly to the Ottomans. By the time the 14th century arrived, the Byzantine Empire was in irreversible decline. The Ottomans continued their expansion, and by 1453, just over 2 centuries after Michael VIII's death, Constantinople would fall to the Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the conclusion of an era that had lasted for over 1,000 years. In many ways, Michael VIII's Palaiologos' reign represents a fleeting moment of hope in the long, slow collapse of the Byzantine Empire. His restoration of Constantinople was a brilliant military and diplomatic achievement, but it ultimately only postponed the inevitable. The forces that led to the Byzantine Empire's demise, external threats, internal disunity, and a failure to modernize, remained powerful even in the years of Michael's reign. Despite his many challenges, Michael VIII's legacy should not be defined solely by the empire's eventual fall. He was a leader who understood the precariousness of the Byzantine position and worked tirelessly to protect what remained of his empire. His reign marked the final effort by the Byzantine Empire to regain its lost grandeur. While he was unable to prevent its eventual collapse, Michael VIII can still be remembered as a ruler who fought against overwhelming odds to restore his empire's capital and its sense of identity. Perhaps Michael's greatest achievement, one that is often overlooked, is his ability to buy time. The diplomacy he engaged in, particularly with the West, allowed the Byzantines to survive longer than they might have otherwise. Though the Latin Empire's collapse was catastrophic for the Byzantine world, Michael's deft handling of the situation ensured that the Byzantines were able to hold on to Constantinople and the remnants of their empire for several more decades. His decision to restore the city's ancient Byzantine identity, although controversial, was an attempt to reconnect with the past and secure a future for the empire in a world that was rapidly changing. The legacy of Michael VIII is in many ways a tragic one. He fought valiantly to restore a decaying empire, yet the forces of history proved to be too powerful for him to overcome. His life and reign remind us that even the most determined leaders cannot always reverse the tides of history. His struggle to maintain the Byzantine Empire underscores the difficulty of preserving a once great civilization in the face of rising new powers, and the complex interplay between diplomacy, military strategy, and internal governance. And so, as we reflect on Michael VIII's reign, we are left with an important question. What could have been done differently to ensure the survival of the Byzantine Empire? Could Michael VIII have pursued different alliances, or placed more emphasis on military reform? Could a stronger, more united empire have withstood the pressure from the Ottomans, or was the fall of Constantinople an inevitability that no ruler could avoid? Michael VIII's Palaiologos' story is one of ambition, achievement, and ultimately, failure. His life serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of empire, and how even the greatest efforts can sometimes only delay the inevitable. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen, but Michael VIII's place in its history is secure as a man who for a time brought his empire back from the brink, only to see it slowly slip away once again. Building the Great Wall, how the Qin dynasty shaped China. The foundations of the Qin dynasty. The history of China is rich with dynasties, each contributing to the long and complex story of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. Among these, the Qin dynasty stands out as a short but transformative period that set the stage for China's unification and the eventual rise of the imperial system that would endure for over 2 millennia. Though the Qin dynasty lasted only from 21 to 306 BCE, it fundamentally reshaped the course of Chinese history. The story of the Qin dynasty begins with a man who would become one of China's most infamous rulers, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Born in 259 BCE as Ying Zheng, he was the son of the king of Qin, one of the many warring states during the Warring States period of China. This era, lasting from 1475 BCE to 21 BCE, was marked by constant warfare between 7 powerful states vying for control over the region. The Qin state, located in the northwestern part of China, was one of the strongest, but it was far from the most powerful. For centuries, the various states were locked in brutal conflict, with shifting alliances and betrayals, as each tried to dominate the other. Ying Zheng's rise to power was fraught with difficulty. He ascended the throne of the Qin state at the age of 13 after the death of his father, but his early reign was influenced by regents and court officials who held significant power. However, from a young age, Ying Zheng displayed remarkable ambition, intelligence and ruthlessness. He soon took control of his kingdom, purging rivals and asserting his authority. During his early years as king, Ying Zheng worked to consolidate power within the Qin state and increase its military strength. He pursued aggressive military campaigns to weaken neighboring states and absorb their territories. Unlike previous rulers, who were content with expanding their borders through alliances or compromises, Ying was determined to conquer and unify the entire Chinese subcontinent. By 2021 BCE, after nearly a decade of relentless military campaigns, Ying succeeded in conquering the 6 other warring states, Qi, Chu, Yan, Zhao, Wei, and Han, and brought them under the rule of the Qin state. This was a monumental achievement, as it marked the first time that China was unified under one ruler. To symbolize this accomplishment, Ying took the title Qin Shi Huang, meaning First Emperor of Qin. With this title, he not only marked the end of the Warring States period, but also the beginning of the imperial era that would define China for the next 2,000 years. Yet, the unification of China was just the beginning. The real challenge for Qin Shi Huang lay in how to maintain control over such a vast and diverse land. The newly unified China consisted of regions with different customs, dialects, and traditions, and the emperor faced the enormous task of ensuring stability and creating a lasting administrative framework that could oversee this sprawling empire. To achieve this, Qin Shi Huang enacted sweeping reforms. One of his first steps was to standardize various aspects of life within his empire. He introduced a single system of writing, allowing for more consistent communication and record-keeping across the newly unified state. This was essential for an empire that spanned such a large and diverse territory. He also standardized measurements for length, weight, and volume, ensuring that trade and commerce could function smoothly throughout the empire. Even the currency was standardized, with Qin Shi Huang introducing a uniform coinage system that further facilitated trade and economic integration. Yet, it was his military ambitions that truly set Qin Shi Huang apart from his predecessors. His aggressive expansionism had already made him the ruler of a unified China, but he understood that the borders of his empire would always be vulnerable to external threats. To secure his realm, particularly from the nomadic tribes of the north, he undertook one of the most ambitious construction projects in Chinese history: the building of the Great Wall. The need for defense in the north had been apparent for centuries. The nomadic tribes of the steppes, particularly the Xiongnu, had often raided the settled agricultural regions of northern China. During the Warring States period, the various states had built walls to protect themselves from these incursions. But these walls were fragmented and lacked a unified defense strategy. Qin Shi Huang understood that only a coordinated, large-scale effort could ensure the long-term security of his empire. The Great Wall would become his answer to this challenge. Construction of the wall began shortly after the unification of China. The emperor tasked his engineers and laborers with building a massive barrier stretching across the northern frontier, from the Bohai Sea in the east to the Gobi Desert in the west. However, this was no ordinary wall. It was an immense feat of engineering, involving thousands of workers, soldiers, and convicts who were conscripted to labor on this monumental project. The work was grueling and dangerous, with many workers dying in the process due to exhaustion, disease, and accidents. The wall itself was not a single continuous structure, rather it was a series of walls, watchtowers, and fortresses that were connected and reinforced over time. It was designed to provide both physical protection and a strategic advantage. The wall's primary purpose was to prevent invasions from nomadic tribes, but it also served as a symbol of Qin Shi Huang's authority, his ability to marshal vast resources, and his commitment to protecting the empire he had created. Yet, as with many great undertakings, the Great Wall was not without its challenges. The sheer scale of the project led to logistical difficulties, and the lack of coordination between various regions meant that sections of the wall were often incomplete or ineffective. Despite these shortcomings, the Great Wall became one of the most enduring symbols of Qin Shi Huang's reign. Though it would not become the imposing, cohesive structure that it is often imagined as today, the wall was the precursor to later walls and fortifications that would be expanded upon by subsequent dynasties, most notably the Ming dynasty. However, Qin Shi Huang's ambition did not stop at the wall. He sought to solidify his legacy in other ways as well. One of his most famous and controversial achievements was the creation of his tomb, which is said to house the Terracotta Army, a vast army of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots meant to protect him in the afterlife. This tomb, located near Xi'an, is one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in history, showcasing the emperor's desire for immortality and his belief in the divine power of his reign. Qin Shi Huang's reign, though marked by significant achievements, was also fraught with cruelty and excess. His quest for immortality led him to search for elixirs of life, leading to the mass mobilization of resources and the exploitation of his people. He also famously ordered the burning of books and the burying of scholars who opposed his vision for the empire. In an effort to consolidate his absolute power and eliminate dissent, his brutal methods and dictatorial rule have left him a controversial figure in Chinese history. But despite the darkness that sometimes surrounded his rule, Qin Shi Huang's impact on China is undeniable. He forged a unified state from the warring factions, established the foundations for future imperial China, and began the monumental task of defending the empire's northern borders with the Great Wall. What would have become of China without Qin Shi Huang's ambition? Would his empire have endured without the defense he so meticulously planned? Or was the unification of China a fleeting achievement, doomed to collapse without the stability he sought to impose? The fall of the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang's reign, though remarkable for its achievements, was also marred by his harsh methods and absolute control. His efforts to solidify and protect the empire through monumental projects like the Great Wall, the standardization of Chinese writing and measurements, and the creation of the Terracotta Army were all aimed at leaving a legacy that would ensure the strength and stability of the newly unified empire. However, his methods, which included strict authoritarian rule and extreme measures to eliminate opposition, would prove to be his downfall. Despite his monumental accomplishments, Qin Shi Huang's rule was not universally beloved. His imposition of strict legalist policies, which emphasized harsh punishments and a rigidly controlled society, created widespread resentment. The emperor's relentless pursuit of power and immortality led to the suffering of many, particularly the forced laborers who were conscripted to work on his many grand projects, including the construction of the Great Wall and his massive tomb. These projects drained the empire's resources and led to widespread famine and hardship. The emperor's quest for immortality, symbolized by his obsession with finding an elixir of life, also took a toll on his people. In his later years, Qin Shi Huang sent expeditions to find mystical substances that could prolong his life, even ordering the deaths of those who criticized his methods. His obsession with this idea became a defining feature of his rule, diverting attention from the very real issues facing his empire. This blind pursuit of eternal life reflected the emperor's fear of death and the uncertainty about what would happen to his empire after his reign. However, these measures, seen as extravagances by many, further alienated his subjects. Qin Shi Huang's death in 1210 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the Qin dynasty. The emperor's sudden death, likely due to poisoning or natural causes, sent shockwaves through the empire. At the time of his death, Qin Shi Huang's son, Qin Shi, was a young, inexperienced ruler. The transition of power was anything but smooth. The emperor's death created a vacuum of leadership, with no clear plan for succession. Though Qin Shi Huang had attempted to establish a system for handling such a transition, the system was flawed, and his son lacked the authority and respect needed to maintain the power of the state. The real power behind the throne was held by the eunuchs and officials who served in the court, many of whom were more interested in personal gain than in the welfare of the empire. These court factions began to fight for control, leading to a breakdown in the central authorities. As a result, the empire quickly became unstable. The people, already disillusioned by harsh taxes, forced labor, and the emperor's authoritarian rule, began to revolt. The final blow to the Qin dynasty came in 29 BCE, just a year after Qin Shi Huang's death. A massive rebellion broke out, led by a man named Chen Sheng, who had been a low-ranking official in the Qin army. Chen's rebellion sparked a wave of uprisings throughout the empire, as peasants and disgruntled soldiers rose against the ruling class. The central government was too weak to suppress these revolts, and soon, the empire began to fragment. In the face of widespread unrest, the Qin dynasty's once imposing military structure began to crumble. The disintegration of the empire was swift, and by 206 BCE, after just 15 years of instability and rebellion, the Qin dynasty officially fell. The fall of the Qin marked the end of the first imperial dynasty of China, and the beginning of the Han dynasty, which would go on to rule for the next 4 centuries. But what led to such a rapid downfall? Despite its military successes, The Qin dynasty was too rigid and brutal to withstand the internal discontent that simmered beneath the surface. Qin Shi Huang's inability to foster loyalty from his people, his extravagant spending on massive projects, and his oppressive legalist policies all contributed to the dynasty's collapse. In contrast to the more moderate policies of the Han dynasty that followed, the Qin Empire's inflexibility proved to be its greatest weakness. While the dynasty's innovations such as the standardization of currency, the written script and legal codes had a profound impact on China, its harshness alienated many of its subjects. In the aftermath of the Qin's collapse, the Han dynasty emerged as the dominant force in China, largely because it provided a more balanced and stable rule. The Han rulers adopted many of the systems and reforms established by the Qin, this as the centralized bureaucracy and standardized systems, but they tempered them with greater benevolence and flexibility. This combination of innovation and moderation allowed the Han dynasty to survive for centuries and become one of the most enduring empires in world history. Yet even as the Qin dynasty fell into history's shadow, its legacy endured. The Great Wall, though far from the imposing structure it would later become, remained a symbol of China's efforts to protect itself from invaders. The legal codes and systems of governance established under Qin Shi Huang set the stage for the political and cultural developments that would shape Chinese civilization for millennia. And while the Terracotta Army, buried in the sands of time, remained a silent testament to Qin Shi Huang's grandeur, the emperor's ambition and the harshness of his reign served as a cautionary tale to future rulers. Looking back, we might ask, was the fall of the Qin dynasty inevitable? Could Qin Shi Huang have ruled more wisely, fostering loyalty and stability, or was his downfall a consequence of the very forces that enabled his rise? Could the dynasty have lasted longer if the emperor had been less focused on the pursuit of immortality and more attuned to the needs of his people? The enduring legacy of the Qin dynasty. The fall of the Qin dynasty in 2006 BCE marked the end of an era, but the legacy of Qin Shi Huang's reign continued to influence China for centuries to come. While the Qin dynasty itself lasted only a short 15 years, the systems and innovations it introduced laid the foundation for China's future imperial structure. Despite the dynasty's collapse due to internal turmoil, its achievements in unifying the empire, standardizing various aspects of Chinese life, and laying the groundwork for Chinese imperial rule, would shape the future of the nation. The most enduring legacy of the Qin dynasty is the concept of centralized imperial rule. Qin Shi Huang's unification of China in 201 BCE brought together disparate states, each with its own laws, currencies, and culture. His efforts to standardize the writing system, currency, weights and measures, and even the axle width of carts were revolutionary for the time. These reforms made communication and trade across the vast empire much more efficient, paving the way for economic growth and social cohesion. Although the Qin dynasty was short-lived, these reforms would continue to serve as a model for future Chinese dynasties, particularly the Han, which inherited many of the Qin's administrative and legal practices, but tempered them with a more benevolent approach. Qin Shi Huang's vision of a unified empire also extended to the realm of infrastructure. The massive construction projects he initiated, most notably the Great Wall, represented his ambition to secure the northern borders of China. While the wall built during his reign was not the massive structure we associate with the Great Wall today, it was the first step in a long history of fortifications. The wall itself, though often incomplete and fragmented, served as both a physical barrier against nomadic invasions and a symbol of the emperor's power. Over time, successive Chinese dynasties would continue to expand and reinforce the Great Wall, making it one of the most iconic symbols of Chinese civilization. In addition to the Great Wall, Qin Shi Huang undertook the construction of roads and canals that linked the far-flung corners of his empire. These transportation networks facilitated the movement of armies, goods and people, allowing for greater control over the empire and the easy distribution of resources. The emperor's commitment to infrastructure not only strengthened his military capabilities, but also laid the groundwork for economic growth, as trade flourished along these routes. These projects, though costly and labor-intensive, ultimately contributed to China's long-term prosperity and stability. Another significant legacy of the Qin dynasty was the emperor's creation of a standardized legal system. Qin Shi Huang's adoption of legalism as the guiding principle of governance may have been harsh, but it was also incredibly effective in maintaining order and consolidating power. The legal system he established was based on strict laws and severe punishments for transgression. While this system led to widespread fear and resentment during his reign, it also created a structure of governance that would influence Chinese law for centuries. The imperial legal system, which emphasized centralized control and the rule of law, remained a cornerstone of Chinese governance through the Han Dynasty and beyond. However, despite these lasting achievements, the Qin dynasty's downfall was a stark reminder of the limits of autocratic rule. Qin Shi Huang's reliance on harsh measures, such as forced labor, book burnings, and executions of those who opposed him, led to widespread discontent and rebellion. The Qin dynasty's downfall after his death was swift, and the empire collapsed into chaos. The brief and tumultuous reign of the Qin served as a cautionary tale for future rulers, demonstrating the dangers of excessive control, cruelty, and the alienation of the people. The fall of the Qin dynasty was also marked by the rise of the Han dynasty, which would become one of the most enduring and influential empires in Chinese history. The Han dynasty, though it was founded in the aftermath of the Qin's collapse, retained many of the Qin's administrative reforms, such as centralized bureaucracy and legal systems. However, the Han rulers learned from the mistakes of the Qin and implemented a more moderate and benevolent approach. The Han dynasty adopted Confucianism as the state philosophy, emphasizing morality, kindness, and governance based on virtue, rather than the harsh and strict legalism of the Qin. This shift in philosophy helped establish a more stable and prosperous society, allowing the Han dynasty to rule for over 4 centuries and to shape China's cultural and political development. Despite the brutal nature of his reign, Qin Shi Huang's vision for China left an indelible mark on the nation. The concept of a unified China under a single emperor became the defining characteristic of Chinese political organization for over 2,000 years. The imperial system, which Qin Shi Huang initiated, would continue to evolve throughout subsequent dynasties, culminating in the establishment of the Qin dynasty in the 17th century. Moreover, the Qin dynasty's influence extended far beyond China's borders. The ideas of centralized control and imperial unity inspired neighboring states and cultures throughout East Asia. The structure of Chinese governance and its emphasis on strong central authority became models for countries like Korea and Japan, which adapted elements of Chinese culture and political organization in their own systems. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Qin dynasty, however, lies in the collective memory of its achievements and failures. Qin Shi Huang remains a controversial figure in Chinese history. His pursuit of immortality, the harshness of his rule, and his disregard for human life have earned him a place in history as a tyrant. Yet, at the same time, his vision for a unified, strong China has been celebrated as the foundation of Chinese civilization. His architectural feats, military campaigns, and centralized government created a lasting infrastructure that would support China's future for centuries. The legacy of Qin Shi Huang is one of ambition, accomplishment, and ultimately, caution. As we reflect on the Qin dynasty's legacy, we must ask ourselves, could China have been unified and sustained in the way that it was without Qin Shi Huang's iron will? Was his harsh rule a necessary price for the unity that defined China's future? Or was it a tragic example of what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of one ruler without the moderation of wise counsel? Qin Shi Huang's empire may have fallen quickly, but the systems he put in place and the lessons learned from his rise and fall shaped the destiny of China for centuries to come. The Great Wall, the legal systems, and the imperial structure he established endure as a testament to his vision, even as they also serve as a reminder of the complexities of governance and the delicate balance between power and compassion. The daily life of a peasant in the Middle Ages, a life of work and struggle, a day in the life of a medieval peasant. The medieval world was one defined by rigid social structures, harsh living conditions, and constant toil. While the lives of kings, knights, and clergy often dominate our historical imaginations, the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages lived lives that were far less glamorous. The majority of the population was made up of peasants, laborers who worked the land under a system known as feudalism. Though peasants were the backbone of medieval society, their lives were often grueling, marked by long hours of manual labor, limited freedom, and a constant struggle to survive. To understand the life of a medieval peasant, it is important to first understand the agricultural system that defined this period. In feudal Europe, Land was the primary source of wealth and power. Kings, lords, and nobles owned large estates, and the peasants, often referred to as serfs, worked this land in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots for their own subsistence. These peasants were bound to the land, meaning they could not leave without the permission of their lord. This system of land-based service was deeply entrenched in medieval society and shaped the lives of millions. A typical day for a peasant in the Middle Ages began before sunrise, as the work of the land could never be put off. The hours were long and exhausting, dictated by the seasons and the need to ensure a successful harvest. During the growing season, peasants spent most of their days in the fields, planting, tending to crops, and later harvesting them. This meant that during the spring and summer months, a peasant's day often began at first light and continued until dusk, with few breaks in between. For those who worked the land, the primary crops were grains, wheat, barley, and oats, along with vegetables like peas, beans, and cabbage. In addition to crops, many peasants also raised livestock, pigs, chickens, and sometimes cows for food and trade. The work was physically demanding. Fields had to be plowed by hand or with the help of oxen, and sowing, weeding, and harvesting were done manually with simple tools. Though some larger estates had a few workers who specialized in these tasks, most peasants worked alongside their families, performing the back-breaking labor needed to sustain themselves. One of the defining aspects of a medieval peasant's life was the relationship they had with their lord. In exchange for the right to work a portion of land, the peasant was required to give a portion of their harvest to the lord as rent. This could be a fixed amount, or it could be based on a percentage of the crops they grew. Additionally, peasants were often obligated to work on their lord's land for several days a week, performing tasks like repairing fences, harvesting the lord's crops, or maintaining the estate's buildings. These obligations, known as corvée labor, were one of the most burdensome aspects of peasant life. Not only were they expected to work their own land to feed their families, but they were also bound to work the land of their lord without compensation. In addition to the demands of farming, peasants were subject to various taxes and fees. These could include tithes to the church, which were typically about 1/10 of their annual produce, and fees for using the lord's mill or oven. The church played a significant role in the life of a medieval peasant. Many peasants would spend Sundays attending Mass. They would pray for divine protection and a good harvest. For most peasants, life revolved around the seasons, planting in the spring, tending to crops in the summer, and harvesting in the fall. Winter was a time of relative quiet, though it also brought its own set of challenges. Food was often scarce in the colder months, and many peasants would rely on preserved food, such as salted meats and dried grains, to survive the long, harsh winters. However, while work and survival were central to the lives of medieval peasants, there were also moments of community and social interaction. Though peasants were often isolated on their individual plots of land, the village was a vital part of their social structure. Villages were made up of small homes built close together, often with thatched roofs and walls made of timber or wattle and daub. In these communities, peasants would come together for communal tasks, such as threshing grain or harvesting crops. These activities often included socializing, singing, and sharing food, though the work itself was arduous. Religious festivals, too, played a central role in the lives of medieval peasants. These festivals, which were often tied to the agricultural calendar, marked significant moments in the year, such as the harvest or the changing of the seasons. Church festivals were not only times for prayer and worship, but also for feasts, dancing, and socializing. These events provided peasants with a brief respite from the otherwise grueling routine of farm life. The church, despite the heavy toll it took through tithes, was often a central point of comfort and social support for peasants. But what was it like to experience this way of life over the course of a year, through the changing seasons? How did peasants cope with their difficult circumstances, knowing that their lives were largely dictated by forces beyond their control, the whims of the weather, the demands of their lords, and the unrelenting work required to survive? Could a peasant ever dream of something more, or was their fate sealed from birth to death? The hardships and struggles of medieval peasants. While life for peasants in the Middle Ages often seemed defined by toil and hardship, it is important to understand that there were many challenges they faced that went beyond the long hours in the fields. and the constant demands of feudal obligations. These struggles shaped not just their daily lives, but also their health, their relationships, and their very survival. One of the greatest hardships for medieval peasants was the unpredictability of the weather. A peasant's livelihood was directly tied to the success of the harvest, which in turn depended on the weather. A good year with plenty of rain and sunshine could result in an abundant crop, but a drought, excessive rainfall, or a late frost could spell disaster. In such cases, peasants often faced famine, as their crops would fail and their families would have to rely on the reserves of stored grain if there were any. Famines were not uncommon in the Middle Ages, and they could have devastating effects. During periods of drought or crop failure, food shortages were widespread, and people often turned to extreme measures to survive. There were reports of people resorting to eating things like roots, bark, and even their livestock in times of severe famine. Even worse, famine often led to outbreaks of disease, as the malnutrition and weakened immune systems of the population made them more vulnerable to illness. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the 14th century, would later devastate the peasant population, but earlier pandemics also wiped out vast numbers of rural communities. Health was a constant concern for peasants, who lacked access to modern medicine or knowledge about hygiene. The conditions in which they lived and worked only made matters worse. Small homes, often overcrowded and poorly ventilated, were breeding grounds for disease. Lack of proper sanitation and waste disposal led to contamination of water sources, further spreading illness. Many peasants suffered from common ailments like dysentery, tuberculosis, and respiratory diseases. Due to these unsanitary conditions, accidents in the fields were another danger. Ploughing with animals, using sharp tools, and working with heavy loads left peasants vulnerable to injury, which could easily lead to infections or even death due to the lack of medical treatment. In addition to the physical hardships, peasants also had to contend with the oppressive system of feudalism, which entrenched inequality in society. The peasants were bound to the land they worked, and the lords they served held significant power over their lives. The lord's manor was often the center of the peasants' world, with the lord controlling everything from the land to the labor, and in some cases, even the peasant's ability to marry or leave the land. This system of servitude was legally binding, and any attempt to break free from it could result in punishment. In the eyes of the lord, peasants were considered property, which meant that their worth was tied to their labor rather than their autonomy. This lack of freedom was a source of great frustration for peasants, but it also led to occasional resistance. Though overt rebellion was rare, there were times when peasants sought to challenge the system. Some attempted to escape, fleeing from their lord's lands and trying to find freedom elsewhere. Others engaged in smaller acts of resistance, such as refusing to work for their lord or withholding the portion of their crop due to be paid as rent. While such acts were usually punished severely, they nevertheless demonstrate the spirit of resistance that existed even in the harshest conditions. The connection between peasants and the church was also one of both comfort and exploitation. The church held immense power during the Middle Ages, and its teachings influenced nearly every aspect of daily life. For peasants, church services and religious festivals provided a sense of community and an opportunity for spiritual solace. The church offered peasants a way to understand the hardships of their life, often teaching that their suffering was part of God's divine plan. At the same time, however, the church was also a significant economic burden. Tithes, often 1/10 of a peasant's produce, were required by the church, regardless of the success of the harvest. These tithes, along with rents owed to the lord, left peasants with little to survive on. The church also exerted a level of control over marriage, property rights, and even personal conduct, further limiting the autonomy of peasants. The church's power and wealth came from the very people who lived under its influence, and while it offered spiritual comfort, it was also a reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that kept peasants at the bottom. The lives of medieval peasants were also shaped by the season. The work they did in the fields was dictated by the agricultural calendar, with planting and harvest times consuming much of their year. But outside of the busy seasons, life could be equally difficult. Winter, for example, was both a time of relative rest and a time of great difficulty. The colder months saw the scarcity of fresh food, and although peasants preserved food for the winter, it was never enough to stave off hunger. If a peasant's crops failed during the harvest, they had little to fall back on. In many cases, this meant surviving on whatever preserved food they had, or worse, turning to external sources of aid. The winter months could also bring harsh weather conditions that made it difficult to maintain homes, and the lack of heating made staying warm a constant challenge. Despite these difficult conditions, the resilience of medieval peasants cannot be overstated. They learned to survive and adapt to their circumstances, relying on community, family, and ingenuity to get by. In the face of hunger, disease, and hard labor, peasants maintained a sense of purpose, with a focus on the simple joys of life. Feasts, festivals, and holidays offered a much-needed escape from the relentless cycle of work, and the bonds of family and community provided a sense of support and solidarity that was vital for survival. The question remains, how did medieval peasants maintain their strength and hope in the face of so many hardships? Was there a hidden resilience that kept them going, even when the odds were stacked against them? Could life for the peasants have ever improved, or were they destined to live lives of servitude and struggle? The legacy and reflection on peasant life. The lives of medieval peasants were harsh, often defined by an endless cycle of work, scarcity, and struggle. Yet, as we reflect on their existence, it becomes clear that their perseverance, ingenuity, and the ways in which they created meaning from the difficult circumstances they faced leave a lasting legacy in the history of the Middle Ages. Peasants, despite their lack of wealth or power, were the foundation of medieval society. They produced the food that fed the nobility and clergy, provided labor for the construction of buildings and roads, and participated in the essential rhythms of daily life. Their work made possible the grand achievements of medieval society, from the towering castles and churches to the expanding cities and trade networks. Though their contributions often went unacknowledged, the work of peasants was the bedrock upon which the medieval world was built. One of the most striking aspects of peasant life was its deep connection to the land. The bond between the peasant and the soil was an enduring feature of medieval agriculture. This connection shaped the rhythm of life, with peasants living in close harmony with nature's cycle. They understood the importance of seasons, weather patterns, and the land's fertility. Through trial and error, peasants learned which crops thrived in different soils and climates, developing agricultural practices that would sustain them through even the harshest conditions. The knowledge passed down from one generation to the next formed a kind of folk wisdom that enabled peasants to adapt to changing circumstances. Even though their lives were controlled by forces beyond their control, peasants, in a sense, controlled the land as much as the land controlled them. Though life was difficult, medieval peasants were not without agency. Despite the oppressive structures of feudalism, they could form tight-knit communities that offered support. The bonds between families in villages were strong, and collective efforts helped ensure survival. Villages often worked together to clear fields, repair roads, or build homes. Even though peasants were bound to the land and subject to the will of their lords, they could come together to manage the affairs of their own lives. This sense of community was also reinforced by the church, which served as a focal point for social interaction, spiritual sustenance, and shared identity. Festivals, religious observances, and communal meals allowed peasants to momentarily escape from their daily grind. Yet, the reality of their existence remained largely one of hardship. Even in times of relative peace, peasants lived in constant fear of crop failure, harsh winters, and disease. The unpredictability of the weather meant that, despite their best efforts, a good harvest could be wiped out by a late frost or prolonged drought. Similarly, the spread of illness, like the Black Death, could wipe out entire villages, leaving a once thriving community decimated. In these times of crisis, peasants often relied on each other to survive, sharing what little food and resources they had. The role of the medieval peasant, though often seen as static and defined by servitude, was more complex than it may initially seem. Over time, especially in the later Middle Ages, peasants began to see the beginnings of social mobility. Changes in the economy, such as the rise of market towns, growing trade networks, and urbanization, offered opportunities for peasants to leave the land and seek work in cities. Some peasants were able to buy their freedom, and others were able to accumulate wealth through commerce or land ownership. This was not a widespread phenomenon, but it signaled that peasants were not entirely bound by the constraints of their social and economic status. The transition from feudalism to a more market-driven economy, particularly after the Black Death in the 14th century, would ultimately lead to changes in the power dynamics between peasants and their lords. The depopulation caused by the plague resulted in labor shortages, which allowed peasants to demand better working conditions and higher wages. In some cases, this led to peasant uprisings, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where peasants took to arms to protest the high taxes and oppressive conditions they faced. While these uprisings did not result in immediate change, they contributed to the gradual decline of the feudal system. In the broader historical context, the legacy of the medieval peasant is one of quiet resistance and endurance. While peasants were often powerless in the face of overwhelming social, political, and economic systems, their labor shaped the world they lived in. Their ability to persist, year after year, to continue working the land, raising families and maintaining their communities, ensured the survival of medieval society through centuries of turmoil. The peasants' lives were marked by struggle, but they were also characterized by resilience. They lived through famine, plague, war, and political upheaval, and yet their labor sustained the world around them. As we reflect on their legacy, we realize that the foundations of the Middle Ages, though largely built on the backs of peasants, were far from invisible. The work of peasants created the material wealth that allowed medieval societies to flourish, from the castles that symbolized the power of kings, to the cathedrals that spoke of spiritual aspirations. The material world of the Middle Ages was made possible by the labor of those who tilled the soil. And perhaps, after all, the question lingers: could the structures of feudalism have endured without the peasantry, or was the survival of the entire system built on the resilience of the very people who were bound to the land? How much of the Middle Ages was really shaped by the peasants' struggles and their efforts to maintain their lives, their families, and their communities? The collapse of the Mayan civilization. What really happened? The rise and glory of the Maya. The ancient Maya civilization, which flourished in what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, is known for its remarkable achievements in architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and art. At its peak, between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya developed one of the most sophisticated and enduring cultures in the Americas. Their cities, often hidden deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, were filled with monumental pyramids, elaborate palaces, and grand plazas. But the Maya were not only known for their monumental structures, they also crafted complex calendars, advanced writing systems, and elaborate social structures. The Maya civilization was not a single empire, but rather a collection of city-states, each with its own ruler and government. These city-states, such as Tikal, Palenque, Capan, and Calakmul, were often in competition with one another for resources, territory, and political dominance. Despite this, they shared a common cultural and religious framework, and many of their cities were connected by trade networks, allowing for the exchange of goods, knowledge, and ideas. The success of the Maya civilization was built on the foundation of a highly organized society. The Maya developed agricultural techniques that allowed them to thrive in the diverse landscapes of Mesoamerica. They utilized advanced methods of irrigation, terracing, and crop rotation, which supported their growing populations. The Maya were also skilled in the cultivation of staple crops like maize, beans, and squash, which formed the basis of their diet. This agricultural productivity allowed their cities to grow and develop into centers of culture, commerce, and governance. Maya society was deeply connected to religion. They believed in a pantheon of gods who governed various aspects of life, including agriculture, weather, and warfare. Religion and politics were inseparable, and the rulers of the Maya city-states were considered divine or semi-divine figures, often seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. This belief system permeated every aspect of Maya life, from the construction of their cities to the layout of their sacred spaces, where rituals and offerings were made to appease the gods and ensure prosperity. Maya achievements in astronomy were particularly impressive. They had an intricate understanding of the movements of the stars, planets, and the cycles of the moon. This knowledge allowed them to create highly accurate calendars, including the famous 260-day Tzolk'in calendar and the 3065-day Habi calendar. These calendars were used not only for religious purposes, but also to organize agricultural activities, such as planting and harvesting. The Maya's ability to track celestial events and predict eclipses was unparalleled in the ancient world. The Maya also excelled in art and architecture. They built grand stone cities, with towering pyramids, vast palaces, and intricate stone carvings. The ruins of their cities, such as those at Tikal, Copan and Palenque are some of the most spectacular remnants of ancient Mesoamerica. The Maya also developed a complex writing system known as hieroglyphics, which they used to record historical events, royal lineages, and religious texts. These inscriptions, often found on stone monuments, tell the story of the Maya's complex and dynamic civilization. However, despite the Maya's successes and their remarkable advancements, the civilization would eventually experience a dramatic decline. By the end of the 9th century, many of the great cities in the southern lowlands were abandoned, and the civilization seemed to collapse almost overnight. This decline, which has puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries, is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. What happened to cause the fall of such a powerful and sophisticated civilization? Was it the result of internal strife, environmental changes, or a combination of factors? Could the collapse of the Maya civilization have been avoided, or was it an inevitable consequence of the pressures they faced? Theories of decline and the environmental crisis. The collapse of the Maya civilization in the southern lowlands remains one of the most perplexing events in the history of the ancient world. At its height, the Maya civilization was a collection of powerful city-states with complex social, political, and religious structures. Yet, by the end of the 9th century, many of these cities, including some of the greatest centers like Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, were abandoned. What caused this dramatic downfall? Archaeologists, historians, and researchers have proposed several theories, but no single explanation has yet been proven definitive. Many scholars agree that the collapse was likely a result of a combination of factors, rather than any single cause. One of the most widely discussed theories is the idea that environmental degradation played a significant role in the Maya collapse. The Maya were dependent on their environment, particularly their agricultural system, for their survival. Over time, however, their agricultural practices may have caused irreversible damage to the land. Deforestation was a major issue in the southern lowlands, as the Maya cleared vast expanses of forest to make way for fields and buildings. This deforestation, combined with soil erosion, would have reduced the fertility of the land, making it increasingly difficult to sustain large populations. The Mayas' method of slash-and-burn agriculture, while effective for a time, may have also led to the depletion of essential nutrients in the soil. This practice involved cutting down trees, burning them, and then planting crops in the nutrient-rich ash. However, repeated cycles of this method, especially in a densely populated area, would have led to soil exhaustion. As the land became less productive, it would have caused food shortages, weakened agricultural output, and contributed to the gradual collapse of the economy. With a reliance on maize, beans, and squash, the Mayas' food supply was vulnerable to environmental shifts. Crop failure due to soil depletion would have put great strain on society, leading to malnutrition, famine, and social unrest. There is evidence to suggest that the climate also played a crucial role in the Maya collapse. Many of the cities that experienced abandonment around the 9th century are located in areas where the climate may have undergone significant changes. Research has shown that during the height of the Maya civilization there were periods of extreme drought, which would have had devastating effects on an agricultural society. The Maya relied heavily on rainfall to irrigate their crops, and prolonged droughts would have caused crop failures and exacerbated water shortages. Ice core data from the region indicates that between 800 and 1000 CE, a series of severe droughts occurred in the Maya region, particularly in the southern lowlands. These droughts would have made it even harder for the Maya to sustain their agricultural systems, especially considering the already compromised soil quality. Water, a crucial resource for both drinking and irrigation, would have been scarce, and as a result, the basic infrastructure necessary to support large urban populations would have crumbled. Environmental pressures likely led to social and political tensions within the Maya city-state. As resources became scarcer, competition for land and water likely intensified. Rivalries between cities could have escalated, leading to conflicts that further destabilized the region. Warfare between city-states was not uncommon in the Maya world, and during periods of environmental stress, these conflicts may have become even more frequent and violent. The need for resources may have contributed to internal strife, weakening the unity of the Maya civilization and leading to the abandonment of key cities. Another theory that has gained traction is the idea that the Maya elite played a role in the collapse. In many ancient civilizations, power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The Maya were no different. Priests and rulers held power, and their authority was often justified by divine connections and the belief that they could intercede with the gods. The elite class, particularly the kings and priests, were responsible for conducting elaborate religious rituals, which were believed to ensure good harvests and the favor of the gods. However, when the climate turned against them and resources began to dwindle, these elite rulers may have lost their ability to maintain control over the population. As the crops failed and the droughts persisted, the very legitimacy of the rulers would have been called into question. If the gods were no longer responding to the rituals and sacrifices, the people may have lost faith in their leaders. As the power of the elite weakened, internal divisions may have caused the collapse of political structure. The resulting breakdown in leadership could have led to further fragmentation, with smaller groups or rival factions vying for control, weakening the central authority of the city-states. While environmental factors and internal political instability are central to many theories about the collapse, there is also the possibility that external pressures contributed to the Maya's downfall. The Maya were not isolated in their world. They had long-standing trade connections with other Mesoamerican cultures, including the Teotihuacan civilization in central Mexico. The fall of Teotihuacan in the 6th century may have disrupted trade routes and access to vital resources, further weakening the Maya economy. Additionally, the rise of new civilizations, such as the Toltecs, may have diverted resources and political attention away from the southern Maya cities, making it harder for the Maya to recover from their internal struggles. Despite the collapse of the southern lowland cities, it is important to note that not all of the Maya civilization fell at once. Some Maya cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, such as Chichen Itza, continued to thrive for centuries after the decline of the southern cities. These northern cities experienced a different set of conditions and may have been better able to adapt to the changing environment and political landscape. The northern cities eventually fell as well, but their longer survival period suggests that the Maya civilization was not a singular monolithic entity, but a complex web of interconnected cultures and city-states that were affected by different factors at different times. The decline of the southern Maya lowlands did not mark the end of the Maya civilization as a whole. The Maya survived for centuries more, continuing to occupy the region, though the cities and power structures had shifted. The later colonial period saw the arrival of the Spanish, who ultimately decimated the remaining Maya through conquest, disease, and forced labor. The collapse of the Maya civilization is not a single event, but a complex process shaped by a variety of factors. From environmental changes to political strife, the reasons behind the Maya's downfall remain a subject of debate. Yet in many ways the story of the Maya collapse serves as a cautionary tale about the delicate balance between civilization and the environment. It asks us to consider how vulnerable complex societies are to the forces of nature, and how the decisions made by leaders can have profound and far-reaching consequences. What if the Maya had been able to adapt to the changing climate? Could their civilization have endured for much longer, or was their fate sealed by forces beyond their control? Could the rise of new technologies, like irrigation or improved farming practices, have reversed the decline, or was the Maya collapse an inevitable result of human mismanagement of the land? The enduring influence of the Maya and lessons for today. While the sudden abandonment of Maya cities in the 9th century remains a mystery, the legacy of the Maya civilization has lived on through the centuries. Despite the physical collapse of many of their great cities, the Maya people and their culture persisted, adapting to new circumstances and environments. The question of what caused the collapse may never be fully answered, but understanding the Maya's resilience in the face of adversity and their lasting influence is key to recognizing the profound impact they had on the world. Even after the southern cities were abandoned, the Maya civilization did not disappear entirely. As we saw in the previous section, some northern cities, such as Chichen Itza, continued to thrive long after the fall of their southern counterparts. These cities, though smaller and less influential than their predecessors, remained cultural and political centers. Chichen Itza, for instance, became a major hub for trade, religion, and politics, and it was not until the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century that the last remnants of the Maya civilization in these cities were destroyed. The Maya, therefore, had the ability to adapt and survive, even as their world changed drastically around them. One of the most remarkable legacies of the Maya is their advanced knowledge in various fields, including astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Their calendar systems, which included both the Tulking 260-day sacred calendar and the Hab 3065-day solar calendar, are renowned for their accuracy and sophistication. These calendars not only guided religious ceremonies, but also helped the Maya track celestial events such as eclipses and planetary movements. The Maya's understanding of the cosmos was so precise that modern astronomers still admire their accuracy, despite the lack of telescopic technology. Their architectural achievements, particularly their pyramid structures and city layouts, continue to awe modern visitors. The Maya built towering pyramids with complex systems of terraces, each level representing the passage of time or the ascent to the gods. The cities themselves were meticulously planned, with an emphasis on alignment with celestial bodies, indicating the Maya's deep connection to the stars and their belief in the cyclical nature of time. These structures, although now mostly in ruins, stand as enduring symbols of Maya engineering, architectural mastery, and religious devotion. Equally impressive was the Maya's writing system, one of the few fully developed scripts in pre-Columbian Americas, known as Maya hieroglyphics. This writing system combined logograms, symbols that represent words, and syllabic symbols, enabling the Maya to record history, genealogies, and religious texts. Many of these inscriptions have been preserved on stelae, altars, and codices made of bark paper. Though much of the Maya codices were destroyed during the Spanish conquest, a significant number of texts and inscriptions remain, providing insight into the Maya's complex society, politics, and spirituality. But what of the Maya after the collapse of their great cities? While the southern cities fell into ruin, the Maya civilization persisted, albeit in a different form. Many Maya people continued to live in the region, maintaining their culture, language, and tradition. Even today, millions of Maya descendants still inhabit the region, primarily in Guatemala, southern Mexico, and parts of Honduras and Belize. They continue to speak their languages, preserve their traditional crafts, and uphold religious practices rooted in their ancient past. The survival of these traditions demonstrates the enduring strength of the Maya culture, even in the face of colonial oppression and centuries of displacement. In terms of the broader influence, the Maya civilization left a lasting imprint on the development of Mesoamerican culture. Their contributions to agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy influenced later civilizations in the region, including the Aztecs and the Olmecs. While the Maya decline marked the end of one era, it set the stage for the rise of the Aztec Empire, which absorbed and adapted many elements of Maya culture. However, the collapse of the Maya cities serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of complex societies. The Maya civilization's fall was not a sudden event, but rather a slow decline that was influenced by a variety of internal and external factors. The collapse highlights the dangers of overextending agricultural practices without considering long-term environmental consequences. It underscores the vulnerability of societies that depend heavily on natural resources and fail to adapt to changing conditions, whether climate-related or socio-political. In today's world, the lessons of the Maya collapse resonate in the face of our own environmental challenges. Like the Maya, modern societies are deeply connected to the land and the resources that sustain them. As climate change, deforestation, and resource depletion threaten the stability of contemporary civilizations, we are faced with questions about sustainability and the long-term consequences of our action. Can we learn from the Maya's experience and develop systems that balance human progress with environmental stewardship? Can we avoid the mistakes they made in managing their resources? The Maya collapse also raises important questions about leadership and governance. The decline of the Maya cities was in part due to internal conflict, political fragmentation, and the weakening of the ruling elite. The rise and fall of the powerful city-states of the Maya serves as a reminder that no civilization is immune to the pressures of power struggles, mismanagement, and disillusionment among the people. In the modern world, we face similar challenges in terms of political stability and the effectiveness of leadership. What can we learn from the rise and fall of the Maya's elite, and how can we build systems that foster long-term stability and fairness? Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Maya lies in their ability to adapt, endure, and survive in the face of immense challenges. While the grand cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned, the Maya as a people persisted. Their culture, knowledge, and traditions endured, passed down through generations. The Maya may have faced an ecological crisis, but their ability to adapt and find new ways to live demonstrates the resilience of human societies in the face of adversity. The story of the Maya is one of both tragedy and triumph, a testament to the enduring power of culture, tradition, and survival. The Maya civilization may have collapsed in one form, but it lives on today, not only through the descendants of the Maya, but also in the monumental structures they left behind, the wisdom they imparted, and the lessons we can still learn from their rise and fall. As we look at the remnants of the great cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan, we must ask, what would have happened if the Maya had found a way to adapt to the environmental challenges they faced? Could their civilization have endured for centuries more, or was their fall inevitable given the stresses of climate warfare and resource depletion? The slow march of technology in the Victorian era. Tikal, the age of invention and discovery. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a period of profound transformation in Britain and across the world. Under Queen Victoria, Britain emerged as the dominant global power, its empire spanning vast territories and its economy booming with the benefits of industrialization. It was a time of remarkable change, but perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Victorian era is the explosion of technological innovation. While the pace of progress was often slow and incremental, the era marked the beginning of a new age, with inventions and discoveries that would shape the modern world. In many ways, the Victorian period was the beginning of the modern technological world. The earlier part of the century had been dominated by the Industrial Revolution, which introduced the steam engine, mechanized textile production, and the rise of factories. However, by the mid-19th century, technology began to enter a new phase, with advancements that would eventually revolutionize transportation, communication, medicine, and daily life. The steam engine, invented by James Watt in the late 18th century, had already transformed industries and the transportation sector, but in the Victorian era, the potential of steam power was expanded. Railroads, already in use for a few decades, grew rapidly, transformed the landscape of Britain and the world. The rail network connected remote areas of the country, making it possible to transport goods and people faster and more efficiently than ever before. The construction of railroads spurred economic growth, creating jobs and facilitating trade, but it also had profound effects on social structures, as people could now travel to cities and towns that were once isolated. Perhaps the most significant transformation brought about by the Victorian era was the shift in communication. The development of the telegraph in the 1830s and 1840s by inventors like Samuel Morse allowed people to communicate across vast distances, almost instantaneous. Prior to the telegraph, long-distance communication took days, weeks, or even months. The telegraph revolutionized business, news dissemination, and even warfare, as messages could be sent quickly between distant places. The advent of the telegraph was so profound that it is often considered the first truly global communication network, laying the groundwork for the rapid exchange of information that would define the next century. As the world grew more interconnected, Victorian Britain also saw advances in transportation. The introduction of steamships, particularly after the 1830s, revolutionized sea travel. Steamships were faster, more reliable, and could carry greater loads of cargo and passengers than their sail-powered counterparts. The success of steamships paved the way for the first transatlantic passenger services, shrinking the world and bringing nations closer together. Yet, the pace of technological progress was not uniformly fast. While some advancements were rapid and dramatic, others were more gradual, building on the foundation laid by earlier discoveries. One of the most profound but slow developments was in the field of medicine. The Victorian era saw a shift from centuries of rudimentary, often ineffective medical practices to a new understanding of hygiene, disease, and anatomy. One of the key breakthroughs in medical science during the Victorian period was the development of anesthesia. Before the widespread use of anesthetics, surgery was an excruciatingly painful experience, often leading to shock or death due to the trauma. The introduction of ether and chloroform in the mid-19th century allowed surgeons to perform operations without causing unbearable pain to their patients. This breakthrough was not only a major medical milestone, but also had profound social implications, as it made surgery safer and more accessible to a larger number of people. Alongside anesthesia, the understanding of germs and hygiene began to take hold. While the theory of germs was still in its infancy, figures like Florence Nightingale and Joseph Lister began advocating for cleaner hospital environments and better hygiene practices in the mid-1800s. Nightingale's work during the Crimean War, where she improved sanitary conditions in military hospitals, dramatically reduced the spread of infection and earned her the title of the founder of modern nursing. Lister, influenced by the work of Louis Pasteur, introduced the concept of antiseptic surgery, which drastically reduced the number of post-operative infections. These gradual advancements in medicine would go on to save countless lives, though it would take time for the wider medical community to fully embrace these new ideas. Even more dramatic advances were happening in the realm of chemistry and materials science. The mid to late 19th century saw the development of new synthetic materials, such as dyes and plastics, that began to revolutionize the manufacturing industry. One of the most significant innovations was the creation of the Bessemer process in the 1850s, which allowed for the mass production of steel at a much lower cost. Steel became the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, enabling the construction of bridges, railways, and buildings that would reshape the world. The Victorian era also saw the birth of electricity as a practical source of power. While electricity had been understood in theory for centuries, it was not until the late 19th century that practical applications began to emerge. Inventions like Thomas Edison's light bulb, 1879, and the development of electric power stations made it possible to light homes and streets more effectively than gas lamps. Edison's work paved the way for the creation of electrical grids, which would eventually power cities across the world. Though electricity was still in its early stages of development, it was clear that it would be a transformative force. These inventions, though revolutionary, did not occur overnight. Many were the result of decades of incremental advancements, trial and error, and refinement. The Victorian era's technological progress was not an immediate leap into the future, but rather a gradual evolution of ideas and systems that would later define the modern world. Yet, even as the Victorian era experienced this technological boom, it also revealed some of the deeper contradictions of the period. For every new invention that improved lives and contributed to progress, there was often a corresponding social cost. The rapid industrialization that drove technological progress also led to overcrowded cities, poor working conditions, and environmental degradation. Factories were often unsafe, and workers, including children, labored long hours for meager wages. As the Victorian period progressed, the benefits of technological advances were not always equally shared, and the gap between the rich and poor widened. The contradictions of the Victorian age raise an important question. How did the speed of technological progress affect the social fabric of the time? Did the promise of a brighter future outweigh the social costs of industrialization, or were the benefits of these advances distributed unequally? The social and cultural impacts of technological change. As the Victorian era advanced, the rapid pace of technological innovation brought about both optimism and anxiety. The age of invention, with its breakthroughs in transportation, communication, medicine, and manufacturing, transformed every aspect of daily life. However, as much as these innovations contributed to the expansion of industry and society, they also sparked profound social and cultural changes, the effects of which would be felt for generations. One of the most immediate consequences of the technological revolution was the shift from agrarian to urban societies. Prior to the Victorian period, the majority of people lived in rural areas, working as farmers or laborers in small communities. By the end of the 19th century, however, the Industrial Revolution had spurred the rapid growth of cities. Factories, powered by steam engines, sprang up along rivers, and industrial centres such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became bustling hubs of activity. These cities attracted masses of workers, drawn by the promise of jobs in the factories, mills, and mines. The migration to urban centres was a direct result of technological advancements in manufacturing, particularly the mechanization of production. Machines like the spinning jenny, power loom, and steam-powered engines made it possible to produce goods on an unprecedented scale. These innovations allowed for mass production, leading to cheaper goods and an expanding economy. But as the factories grew, so did the population of cities. People flooded in from the countryside in search of employment, contributing to the swelling of urban populations. However, this rapid urbanization also created significant social problems. The new industrial cities were often overcrowded, with insufficient housing to accommodate the growing population. The working-class neighborhoods were cramped, unsanitary, and lacked basic infrastructure. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread quickly in these conditions, and infant mortality rates soared. The squalid living conditions were a sharp contrast to the wealth that industrialists and factory owners were amassing from the fruits of their technological progress. The working conditions in factories were equally grim. Workers, many of them women and children, were forced to endure long hours in dangerous environments for low wages. Factory owners, eager to increase profits, often exploited workers, providing minimal safety and little regard for their well-being. The machines that powered the factories, though technological marvels, were also dangerous, and accidents were frequent. Workers were often subjected to the deafening noise of machines, the dust and filth of the factories, and the constant physical strain of labor. As the cities grew, so did the disparity between the wealthy industrialists and the impoverished working class, and tensions between the two groups simmered. The emergence of the working class in industrialized cities led to the rise of social movements and labor unions. As workers began to demand better pay, working conditions and hours, the Victorian era saw the beginnings of modern labor rights movements. The Factory Acts, passed in the early 19th century, began to address some of the most egregious abuses, such as child labor and excessive working hours. However, it wasn't until the later part of the century that workers began to gain significant political power, as unionized labor became more organized and more vocal. While the Industrial Revolution was changing the face of cities, it also had a profound impact on the rural landscape. Mechanized farming equipment, such as the steam-powered plow and mechanical reaper, began to replace traditional farming methods. This led to increased agricultural productivity, but it also resulted in a decline in the number of farm workers needed. As agriculture became more efficient, many rural laborers were displaced, further fueling migration to the cities. While some rural areas saw prosperity due to increased food production, others faced hardship, as small farmers were squeezed out by larger, mechanized operations. The social structure of the countryside, too, was affected by technological change, as old patterns of life were uprooted by the forces of industrialization. Despite these challenges, the technological progress of the Victorian era also brought about improvements in living standards for many. The growth of industry, the spread of railroads, and the advent of steamships made goods and services more affordable and accessible. The availability of mass-produced goods made household items like clothing, furniture, and food cheaper for middle-class families. The rise of the middle class was another significant outcome of technological progress, as businessmen, merchants, and professionals capitalized on the growing economy. This group, which had previously been small and often marginalized, gained power and influence during the Victorian era, benefiting from the increased availability of consumer goods and services. Technological progress also had significant effects on leisure and culture. The invention of the telegraph and the development of railroads and steamships made travel faster and more accessible than ever before. For the first time in history, people could travel significant distances with relative ease. The rise of tourism, particularly to places like the seaside or the countryside, allowed people to enjoy leisure time that had previously been reserved for the wealthy elite. The middle class, especially, found new opportunities for recreation, as mass entertainment like theatre performances, circuses, and exhibitions became increasingly popular. The most visible symbol of Victorian cultural change was the rise of consumerism. As industrialization enabled mass production, a consumer economy began to emerge. Shops, department stores, and advertisements proliferated, and the middle class began to embrace a new consumer-oriented lifestyle. The ability to buy goods and services previously out of reach created a sense of prosperity and social mobility, though this was not shared equally across society. The Victorian obsession with material goods, appearance, and status led to new social norms, as the desire for outward displays of wealth became increasingly important. Yet, this consumerism and technological progress came at a cost. The environmental impacts of industrialization became evident, as pollution from factories, mines and steamships began to damage the air, water and land. The rapid expansion of cities led to deforestation and the destruction of natural habitats. While the steam engine and mechanized production created wealth and efficiency, they also left a legacy of environmental degradation that would become more apparent in the following centuries. Victorian society was also deeply shaped by the cultural and moral values of the time. The rapid pace of technological progress was often seen as a symbol of human achievement, but it also gave rise to anxieties about progress and its consequences. Social reformers and writers, such as Charles Dickens, raised awareness about the plight of the poor, the working class and the injustices that industrialization brought with it. Though technological advances improved many aspects of life, they also exposed the deep inequalities of Victorian society and raised questions about the ethical implications of progress. As the Victorian era continued into the 20th century, the technological innovations of the time set the stage for even greater advances in the years to come. The rise of electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the invention of the telephone and radio were just some of the milestones that would continue to shape the world. Yet, the Victorian period remains a unique moment in history, a time when the slow march of technological progress brought profound social, economic and cultural changes that still influence our world today. As we look back on the Victorian era, we must ask, did the rapid pace of technological change in the 19th century lead to a better world, or did it exacerbate inequalities and create new social divides? Were the benefits of progress shared equally, or were they concentrated in the hands of a few? And as we face our own technological revolution in the 21st century, what lessons can we learn from the challenges and successes of the Victorian period? The legacy and lessons of Victorian technology. The Victorian era, a time of unparalleled technological and social change, left a lasting imprint on the modern world. The era saw inventions that transformed everyday life and fundamentally altered the relationship between people and the world around them. From the expansion of railroads and the advent of steamships, to the creation of mass-produced goods and improvements in medicine, Victorian technology reshaped society in ways that still resonate today. But as we reflect on the legacy of this technological revolution, we must also ask, what lessons can we draw from the successes and failures of the Victorian period? The most enduring legacy of Victorian technology is the way it shaped modern industry and urban life. The rise of factories and mass production techniques laid the foundation for the global economy that emerged in the 20th century. The efficiency of mechanized production, pioneered in the textile mills and later expanded to other industries, set the stage for a consumer-driven world. The idea that goods could be produced quickly and in large quantities became a model for future industrial societies. The development of steam engines, which powered factories and transportation systems, transformed industries, not only in Britain but across the globe. Steamships and railroads broke down the barriers of distance, bringing nations closer together and enabling the rapid movement of goods, resources and people. But as the world became more interconnected, the social effects of industrialization began to show. The wealth generated by industry was unevenly distributed, with a small class of industrialists and entrepreneurs reaping the benefits while many workers endured harsh conditions. The rise of the middle class, while significant, came at the expense of the working class, who often worked long hours in dangerous conditions for meager wages. Victorian society was marked by stark social stratification, and technological progress, though it brought many benefits, also deepened inequality. The exploitation of labor in factories, the use of child labor, and the harsh conditions in which many workers lived are stark reminders of the social costs of industrial progress. The environmental impact of Victorian technology also became increasingly evident. The growth of cities and the expansion of factories created pollution on an unprecedented scale. Coal, the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution, powered steam engines and factories, but it also filled the air with smoke and soot, contributing to air pollution in industrial cities like London. The rise of railways and steamships, while revolutionary in transportation, also contributed to environmental degradation. The rapid expansion of industrial production and the accompanying increase in consumption led to resource depletion and environmental changes that would continue to have lasting consequences. The Victorian period in many ways set the stage for the environmental challenges of the modern world, as the unchecked growth of industry began to take a toll on the planet. In terms of health, the Victorian era brought both progress and challenge. Advances in medicine, particularly in the areas of sanitation and surgery, saved countless lives. The introduction of anesthesia, antiseptics, and better hygiene practices in hospitals marked the beginning of modern medicine. The work of figures like Joseph Lister and Florence Nightingale, who advocated for cleaner hospitals and better healthcare standards, laid the groundwork for improvements in public health that continue to benefit us today. However, despite these medical advances, the rapid growth of cities also led to unsanitary living conditions for many working-class families. Poor housing, lack of proper sewage systems, and overcrowding contributed to the spread of disease, particularly in the early part of the Victorian era. Cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases ravaged urban populations, exposing the gap between technological progress and social well-being. Victorian technological advancements also had a profound impact on the cultural landscape. The rise of mass production and the expansion of railroads made goods more affordable and accessible, leading to the growth of consumer culture. People who had never had access to mass-produced goods such as clothing, furniture, and books now had the means to buy these items. This democratization of consumer goods helped fuel the growth of the middle class and the expansion of leisure activities, such as tourism, theatre, and music halls, became part of everyday life. However, with the increase in consumerism came a shift in social values. The Victorian obsession with material wealth, social status, and appearances gave rise to a culture of consumption that prioritized outward displays of success. The gap between the wealthy elite and the working poor became more pronounced, as social mobility remained limited for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Another aspect of Victorian technology that continues to influence us today is the foundation it laid for modern infrastructure. The growth of railroads, the establishment of telegraph lines, and the widespread use of electricity all helped shape the development of modern cities. The design and construction of bridges, tunnels, and roads in the Victorian era laid the groundwork for the transportation networks that define our world today. The Victorians also pioneered urban planning, creating parks, public squares, and green spaces to counteract the effects of industrialization and improve the quality of life for city dwellers. While these efforts were not perfect, they marked the beginning of a movement toward urban development that takes into account both functionality and aesthetics. As we consider the broader lessons of the Victorian technological revolution, we are faced with questions about progress and its costs. The Victorians were both pioneers and victims of their technological innovations. They ushered in a new era of industry, medicine, and culture, but they also grappled with the social and environmental consequences of that progress. The rise of industrial capitalism, while providing unprecedented wealth and opportunity for some, also deepened social inequalities and set the stage for the labour movements and social reforms of the 20th century. The Victorians created the modern world in many ways, but they also exposed the dangers of unchecked industrialization and the need for balance between technological advancement and social well-being. The Victorian era, in many ways, serves as a mirror for our own time, as we face the rapid pace of technological change in the 21st century, whether it's the rise of artificial intelligence, climate change, or new medical technologies. We must ask ourselves, what are the social, environmental, and ethical costs of progress? How can we ensure that the benefits of technological advancement are shared more equally? What lessons can we learn from the Victorians, both from their successes and their failures, to navigate the challenges of the modern world? As we look back on the Victorian era, it's clear that technological progress can be a double-edged sword. The era's great achievements gave rise to the modern world, but also raised important questions about the relationship between technology, society, and the environment. The slow march of technology during the Victorian period was not just about innovation, but about the consequences of that innovation, an ongoing story that continues to unfold today. The rise and fall of the Hanseatic League, trade and the Middle Ages. The origins of the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League, a powerful commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds, rose to prominence in the late Middle Ages. Though it existed for several centuries, its most influential period was from the 13th to the 15th centuries, when it became one of the most significant economic forces in Northern Europe. The story of the Hanseatic League is one of trade, cooperation, and eventual decline, a complex narrative that sheds light on the economic, political and social dynamics of medieval Europe. The origins of the Hanseatic League are often traced to the rise of trade in the northern European Baltic and North Sea regions. By the 12th century, cities in present-day Germany, Denmark, Poland and the Netherlands began to experience growth due to the expansion of trade routes and a flourishing economy. These cities sought to protect their commercial interests and safeguard the routes by which goods such as furs, timber, fish, salt and grain were transported across the seas. The need for protection against pirates, rival merchants and shifting political powers prompted cities along the northern coasts to begin forming alliances. The first concrete step toward the formation of the League occurred in the 12th century, when Lübeck, a city in northern Germany, established a trade monopoly along the Baltic. Lübeck's merchants, seeking protection for their ships and goods, began to negotiate agreements with other cities. By the 13th century, a series of agreements called Hanseatic Charters were created, providing mutual protection and exclusive trading rights. The merchants involved in the League worked together to ensure that their collective interests were protected and that they had the ability to control prices, limit foreign competition, and access the wealth of the Baltic and North Sea region. The League, however, was not an empire or a kingdom. It was a loose federation of merchant guilds. It did not have a single central government or leader, but rather was composed of independent city-states that formed alliances with one another when it suited their interests. Each member city, known as a Hanse, maintained its autonomy, yet they all agreed to a series of economic, political, and military codes that benefited their collective trade ambitions. They also established common laws and standards for the protection of merchants, ensuring that trade agreements could be enforced across their various cities. The most famous and influential city of the League was Lübeck, often considered the queen of the Hanseatic League. Lübeck became the de facto leader of the League, and its merchants led the charge in establishing trading posts along key ports in northern Europe. It was through Lübeck's efforts that the League expanded to include cities in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and the Baltic region. The League's membership grew as the cities realized the collective benefits of pooling resources for protection and trade. The League's power and influence were felt far beyond the borders of the cities it represented. The Hanseatic merchants built a vast network of trade routes across the Baltic Sea and later the North Sea, linking the cities of northern Europe to the rest of the world. Major trading centres such as Bruges, in present-day Belgium, London, and Novgorod became key hubs for the flow of goods from the east and west. The Hanseatic League controlled the trade in goods such as timber, furs, salt, grain, and luxury items like wax, amber, and herring. Through the use of trading posts called kontori, which were established in foreign cities, Hanseatic merchants were able to control the distribution of these goods across Europe. The League also maintained its own fleet of ships, which was used for both trading and defense. By the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had a powerful navy, capable of protecting its trade routes and asserting its dominance in the region. The League often engaged in naval battles with pirates, other rival trading groups, and occasionally with the kingdoms and empires that sought to control trade in the Baltic and North Sea regions. The naval prowess of the League helped it maintain its position as the preeminent trading power in northern Europe for centuries. But the League's power was not purely economic. It also had significant political influence. The cities of the Hanseatic League could wield their collective power to negotiate with kings and princes, securing favourable trade agreements, tax exemptions, and even political concessions. The League's ability to form alliances with powerful monarchs allowed it to expand its influence beyond trade. In some cases, cities of the League were granted autonomous status, where they could govern themselves without interference from local rulers. This was particularly true in the Baltic and Scandinavian regions, where the League played a role in determining political power. However, as the 14th century drew to a close, the Hanseatic League's power began to wane. The reasons for the decline were complex, and a number of factors contributed to the League's weakening grip on northern European trade. One of the major causes of the League's decline was the changing political and economic landscape in Europe. As European nations, such as Denmark, Sweden and Russia, began to consolidate power, the Hanseatic cities lost some of the autonomy they had enjoyed. In the Baltic, the rise of powerful monarchies meant that the League's influence was no longer as dominant as it had once been. The centralized powers of the kingdoms in the region began to impose their own regulations and tariffs on trade. undermining the League's ability to operate independently. Another factor was the rise of new economic centers and competitors. As trade routes expanded across Europe, new trading hubs such as Amsterdam and Antwerp began to challenge the League's monopoly. The development of new ships, more efficient navigation techniques, and new markets meant that the Hanseatic cities no longer had the control over trade they had once enjoyed. The economic and political shift toward more centralized nation-states also made it more difficult for the League to maintain its alliances and defend its interests. Additionally, the League's structure began to show signs of strain. While the Hanseatic League had been a loose confederation of independent cities, by the 15th century, internal conflicts between member cities became more frequent. Smaller cities within the League started to feel sidelined by the more powerful trading centers, and disputes over trade rights and governance began to weaken the unity that had once held the League together. Ultimately, the decline of the Hanseatic League was sealed by a combination of external pressures and internal divisions. By the end of the 16th century, the League was no longer a dominant force in European trade. While some of its cities, such as Lübeck and Hamburg, continued to maintain their status as important commercial centers, the collective power of the Hanseatic League had disappeared. Despite its decline, the legacy of the Hanseatic League continues to be felt today. The League played a key role in the development of European trade networks and helped lay the groundwork for the modern global economy. It also set a precedent for international cooperation, as the cities of the League worked together to protect their mutual interests and build a shared infrastructure of trade. The concept of cooperative trade alliances, which was so central to the Hanseatic League, is a model that is still relevant in the modern era, especially as nations and businesses continue to navigate the complexities of international trade and economics. The story of the Hanseatic League serves as a reminder of the power of commerce and cooperation in shaping the course of history. The rise and fall of this once mighty trading bloc offer important lessons on the role of economic power in shaping political and social systems. And as we look at our own global economy, it's worth reflecting on the challenges and opportunities that international cooperation and trade can bring. The Hanseatic League's influence and the changing dynamics of trade. The Hanseatic League, once the undisputed economic powerhouse of Northern Europe, had a profound influence on the development of trade, politics, and even the cultural landscape of the medieval world. From its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries, the League not only dominated the Baltic and North Sea trade, but also impacted the broader European economy. The legacy of the Hanseatic League is visible in the cities it helped to shape and the economic systems it influenced. The Hanseatic League's most significant contributions were in the realm of trade and economic cooperation. By controlling key trading routes across Northern Europe, the League was able to create a vast and interconnected network of cities, merchants and goods. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen and Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, became vital hubs for the exchange of commodities such as grain, timber, fish, salt, amber, and furs. The League's vast network not only allowed for the transportation of goods, but also facilitated the flow of ideas, technologies, and cultures. For example, the League was instrumental in the introduction of the use of the Hanseatic contour system, permanent trade offices established in foreign cities. These contours served as the League's commercial footholds and operated as independent, quasi-sovereign entities where merchants could carry out business in relative safety, free from the usual tariffs and local restrictions. The establishment of these trading posts was key to the Hanseatic League's ability to monopolize trade in the region. The League was able to dictate terms with other cities and kingdoms, gaining significant political leverage in the process. With the ability to negotiate favorable trade agreements, protect merchant interests and even exert military power when needed, the Hanseatic cities were able to maintain a dominance in trade for several centuries. Their collective economic power made them central players in Northern Europe's political dynamics. The Hanseatic League even had the authority to negotiate directly with kings and emperors, and some cities within the League, such as Lübeck, were granted semi-autonomous rights and privileges, further solidifying their position of power. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Hanseatic League was its ability to function as a cooperative union of cities with shared interests, yet without a centralized government or standing army. Each member city maintained its own independence, and the League itself operated more as a loose federation of merchant guilds. However, the common commercial goals of the League cities, combined with their collective bargaining power, allowed the group to shape the trade policies of entire regions. This model of cooperation, though not without its tensions, provided a framework for cities to come together for mutual economic benefit, rather than through the imposition of a central authority. Yet even as the Hanseatic League's commercial and political influence expanded, it was also facing significant challenges. The League's dominance began to erode by the late 15th century due to several factors, including internal divisions, the rise of powerful nation-states, and competition from new economic forces. The fragmentation of the League, particularly in the wake of the rise of the centralized states of Denmark, Sweden and Poland, created fissures that ultimately led to its decline. These nation-states, now led by monarchs with centralized authority, began to assert their control over trade and commerce, diminishing the Hanseatic League's power to govern and defend trade routes in the Baltic and North Sea. At the same time, the rise of other economic powers, particularly the Dutch, further weakened the League's grip on the global market. The Dutch, with their innovative shipbuilding techniques and more advanced financial systems, quickly overtook the Hanseatic League in terms of maritime trade. The Dutch East India Company and the rise of Dutch colonialism presented new and fierce competition, ultimately overshadowing the Hanseatic League's control over European trade. Additionally, the internal divisions within the League, as well as the increasing autonomy of member cities, further diluted its influence. While the League had once operated as a unified force, by the end of the 16th century, cities began to focus on their own interests rather than those of the collective. Lübeck, the queen of the League, found itself increasingly isolated as other cities sought independence from the constraints of the alliance. The decline of centralized control, combined with the weakening of the League's once vibrant commercial power, marked the beginning of its downfall. The Hanseatic League's decline, while gradual, was ultimately sealed by the changing nature of international trade. As European nation-states grew stronger and more assertive in the 16th century, the centralized powers began to reshape the political landscape of trade. The Hanseatic cities, once the dominant commercial force in Northern Europe, found themselves increasingly sidelined as new economic systems emerged. The League could no longer compete with the growing power of the Dutch and English, who had mastered new methods of financing and shipping. The final blow to the Hanseatic League came in the 17th century, as the League's remaining influence was effectively shattered by the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, and the aggressive expansion of the Swedish Empire. The war disrupted trade in Northern Europe, further weakening the League's fragile economic base. By the mid-17th century, the Hanseatic League had ceased to function as a significant political and economic entity. While some of its cities, such as Hamburg and Lübeck, remained important centers of trade, the once dominant League had disappeared from the political map of Europe. In the end, the Hanseatic League's legacy is one of remarkable economic achievement and influence, but also one of caution about the challenges of adapting to changing political and economic realities. The League was a testament to the power of cooperation and trade, but it also demonstrated the limits of a decentralized system when faced with the rise of powerful nation-states and new global competitors. It is a reminder that even the most powerful economic unions can falter when they fail to adapt to shifting dynamics, and that the forces of centralized authority and technological innovation can transform even the most well-established systems. The story of the Hanseatic League also serves as a precursor to modern economic unions, such as the European Union. It reflects the ways in which economic cooperation and shared interests can bring disparate groups together, while also highlighting the potential risks of over-reliance on that cooperation when external pressures arise. The collapse of the Hanseatic League offers a reflection on the fragility of economic alliances and the importance of flexibility and adaptation in the face of changing political and economic landscapes. The legacy of the Hanseatic League and its influence on modern trade. While the Hanseatic League may have faded as a political and economic entity by the mid-17th century, its legacy continues to resonate in the world of international trade, commerce and cooperation. The League's emphasis on collective economic strength, trade routes, and the protection of merchants and cities set many of the foundational principles for later global economic structures. Its influence can be seen in the development of modern trade alliances, the establishment of global shipping networks, and even the idea of economic cooperation between nations. The most visible remnants of the Hanseatic League's legacy are found in the cities that once formed its core. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg and Bremen, which played central roles in the League, continue to be vibrant commercial hubs. These cities, once bastions of Hanseatic power, remain major centers of trade in Europe, maintaining their status as global economic players. Lübeck, often considered the mother of the League, still retains its historic role as a trading city, with its medieval architecture and port serving as a reminder of its pivotal role in the League's operation. Hamburg, which was a key member, grew into one of Europe's most important ports, and its bustling trade operations continue to reflect the legacy of the Hanseatic merchants. The economic and cultural exchanges fostered by the Hanseatic League also laid the groundwork for the later development of free trade zones and global commerce. The idea of protecting merchants through treaties and agreements, as the League did with its contour system, has been echoed in the modern world through institutions such as the World Trade Organization (WTO) and the European Union. The League's model of decentralized trade cooperation, where individual cities retained some degree of autonomy while benefiting from collective agreements, is mirrored in the way modern trade agreements often balance national sovereignty with regional cooperation. The Hanseatic League also provided an early example of economic networking on a global scale. Its merchants did not just trade within the Baltic and North Sea regions, they established links with far-flung regions, including the Iberian Peninsula, Russia, and even parts of Asia. The League's merchant guilds established trading posts, banks and offices in key cities, creating an interconnected web of commerce that mirrored the later development of modern multinational corporations. The concept of establishing fixed commercial outposts in foreign cities, as the Hanseatic cities did with their contours, is a direct precursor to the global trading companies that emerged in the colonial era, such as the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. In addition to its impact on trade, the Hanseatic League left a significant cultural legacy. The League's cities fostered a unique blend of local and international cultures. Merchants from different parts of Europe, such as Scandinavia, Germany, and the Low Countries, came together, sharing ideas, customs, and languages. This cultural exchange was not just confined to the world of commerce, it also extended to art, architecture, and intellectual life. Many of the Hanseatic cities boasted impressive cathedrals, town halls, and other architectural wonders, blending regional styles with influences from other parts of Europe. The legacy of this cultural melting pot can still be seen in the architecture of cities like Lübeck and Denz, where medieval and Renaissance buildings reflect a deep connection to the past. The Hanseatic League's influence also extended to the evolution of modern banking. The League's merchants and cities played a key role in the development of financial systems that supported long-distance trade. The use of bills of exchange, letters of credit, and other financial instruments allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances without the need to carry large sums of money. These innovations in finance became the foundation of modern banking, enabling the global financial systems that power today's economy. The rise of merchant bankers, who facilitated international trade, is a direct precursor to the development of major financial institutions and global trade networks. The Hanseatic League also foreshadowed modern concepts of economic regulation and the role of international agreements in promoting free trade. Just as the League negotiated treaties with kings and emperors to guarantee the safety of its merchants, today's international trade deals are based on agreements between nations that protect businesses, set tariffs, and regulate the flow of goods. The idea of protecting trade routes, establishing safe zones for merchants, and negotiating favorable trade terms, all of which were pioneered by the Hanseatic League, remains a cornerstone of modern trade diplomacy. However, the Hanseatic League's decline also offers valuable lessons for contemporary trade alliances. One of the primary reasons for the League's fall was its inability to adapt to changing political dynamics. As the power of centralized nation-states grew and new trading powers emerged, the League's decentralized and somewhat fragmented structure became a hindrance. The rise of stronger nation-states such as Sweden, Denmark, and the growing influence of the Habsburg Empire eroded the League's influence and undermined its ability to act cohesively. The League's failure to adapt to these new political realities is a reminder of how vital flexibility and adaptation are to the survival of any economic alliance or trade network. Similarly, the Hanseatic League's decline underscores the challenges faced by trade organizations in an increasingly interconnected world. As global trade has expanded in the modern era, so too have the challenges of managing such vast and diverse networks. Trade agreements today must grapple with issues like climate change, environmental sustainability, and fair labor practices, much as the Hanseatic League once had to address piracy, political instability, and the interests of diverse member cities. The League's eventual decline illustrates how even the most successful economic systems can falter when they fail to address new challenges or adapt to shifting political realities. The Hanseatic League's rise and fall also reveal important lessons about the role of cultural and economic cooperation in shaping history. It was through trade and mutual economic interest that the cities of the League forged powerful bonds, benefiting not just from commercial exchange, but also from the sharing of ideas and innovations. Today's trade alliances, whether regional, like the EU, or global, like the WTO, are built on similar principles of cooperation and collective action. The Hanseatic League's ability to unite disparate cities with a shared economic goal laid the foundation for the cooperative efforts that define modern international trade agreements. In the end, the story of the Hanseatic League is one of innovation, collaboration, and adaptation. While its decline signals the end of an era of medieval trade dominance, the principles it established continue to resonate in the modern global economy. The League's emphasis on cooperation, its pioneering financial systems, and its role in shaping the commercial and cultural landscape of Europe all have lasting effects on today's world. Its rise, success, and eventual fall offer important lessons for the future of international trade, reminding us of the importance of flexibility, cooperation, and the ability to adapt to an ever-changing world. The intrigue of the Spanish Armada, a tale of power and misfortune, the rise of the Spanish Empire and the gathering storm. In the late 16th century, Europe was a continent divided by religion, politics, and power struggle. One of the most powerful and dominant forces of this era was the Spanish Empire, which stretched across vast portions of Europe, the Americas, and beyond. At the height of its power, Spain was considered the preeminent global superpower, and its empire was the largest the world had ever seen. The Spanish Empire's dominance was in part due to the reign of King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598. A devout Catholic, Philip was deeply committed to expanding and defending the power of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. His reign was defined by a series of religious, political, and military conflicts, as well as a series of ambitious military campaigns aimed at expanding and securing Spain's global influence. At the beginning of Philip II's reign, Spain was a nation in ascendance. The discovery of vast amounts of gold and silver from its colonies in the Americas had greatly enriched the Spanish crown, and its influence stretched across the globe. With territories in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, Spain's power seemed unmatched. However, Spain's dominance was also a source of tension and rivalry, particularly with England, which was experiencing its own rise as a maritime power. The seeds of conflict between Spain and England were sown during the reign of King Henry VIII, when England had broken away from the Catholic Church in the 16th century. Under Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, England had become a Protestant nation, while Spain remained staunchly Catholic. Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne in 1558, became the primary figurehead for Protestantism in Europe, much the ire of Philip II. The religious conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Spain created a volatile political situation that would lead to the eventual clash between the two nations. Philip II saw Elizabeth's rise to the throne as a direct threat to Catholicism and the power of the Spanish crown. Elizabeth had supported English Protestant forces in the Netherlands, which were rebelling against Spanish rule. She had also provided support to the infamous English pirate Sir Francis Drake, who attacked Spanish ships and raided their colonies in the Americas. Drake's raids on Spanish treasure fleets were seen as a direct challenge to Spain's economic dominance. As a result, Philip decided that the only way to ensure the supremacy of Catholicism and to quell the threat posed by Elizabeth was through military action. Thus, the idea for a Spanish invasion of England was born. Philip's plan was to send a vast fleet to England, destroy its navy, and eventually dethrone Elizabeth, restoring Catholic rule. This fleet would become known as the Spanish Armada, a name that would be etched in history as a symbol of power, hubris, and miscalculation. The Armada was designed to be a massive military force, one that would dwarf any fleet England could muster. Philip's plan was to send the Armada across the English Channel to land troops in England, supported by the Spanish army in the Netherlands. Once in England, the Spanish forces would march toward London, where Elizabeth would be captured, and the Protestant rebellion would be crushed. The idea was grandiose and ambitious, but it was also fraught with complications. In 1588, Philip II launched the Armada, which consisted of 130 ships, 2,400 cannons, and approximately 30,000 men, including soldiers and sailors. This formidable force was intended to crush England's navy and establish Spanish dominance over the seas. However, from the very beginning, the mission faced significant obstacles. The logistical challenges of coordinating such a massive fleet were immense, and the political tensions between Spain and its allies, particularly the Catholic states of Europe, added further complications. Spain's allies, including the Pope and the Catholic Habsburgs, were not fully united in their support of the invasion. In England, Elizabeth and her advisors were not blind to the threat posed by the Armada. Although the Spanish fleet vastly outnumbered the English navy in terms of size, England had a more maneuverable fleet and a more experienced and battle-hardened group of naval officers. Queen Elizabeth had carefully prepared for the invasion, and her decision to prioritize the defense of her navy proved to be crucial. While Spain's fleet was massive, it was not as agile as the smaller English ships, which were equipped with faster, lighter vessels and better-trained sailors. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and fateful naval encounters in history. But before the Armada could reach England, its journey was plagued by difficulties, many of which would set the stage for its ultimate failure. What led to the collapse of what seemed like an unstoppable force? Was it a matter of luck, or was it the combination of poor planning, logistical missteps, and underestimation of English resolve? The fateful encounter and the fall of the Armada. As the Spanish Armada set sail in May 1588, its mission was clear: invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, and restore Catholic rule. The Armada was a vast collection of ships, 130 in total, each with its own purpose. Some ships were armed with cannons for long-range artillery strikes, while others were troop carriers designed to land the Spanish forces on English shores. The plan was meticulously orchestrated, and with Philip II's military prowess behind it, the Armada seemed destined for victory. But as the fleet made its way toward England, a series of miscalculations, unforeseen challenges, and a determined English defence would seal its fate. The Armada's journey was plagued by early difficulties, many of which were linked to the long distance it had to travel across the rough seas of the Atlantic. The fleet's commanders were unfamiliar with the northern seas, and the ships, while imposing in size, were not suited to the unpredictable and stormy waters of the English Channel. The Armada was forced to navigate a series of hostile environments, from rough seas to winds that worked against their plans. The English navy, in contrast, was more familiar with the seas around their island, allowing them to exploit the weaknesses of the much larger Spanish fleet. In early July 1588, the Spanish Armada finally reached the shores of England, making its first appearance off the coast of Cornwall. However, the Armada had not anticipated the resolute resistance it would face. Queen Elizabeth's navy, commanded by experienced sailors such as Sir Francis Drake, was ready to confront the invaders. The English fleet was smaller, but its ships were faster, more maneuverable, and better equipped for naval combat. The English navy's tactics would prove to be decisive in the ensuing conflict. The first major clash between the two fleets occurred on July 31, 1588, off the coast of Plymouth. The Spanish Armada, with its larger and more cumbersome ships, attempted to form a traditional battle line, hoping to use its superior firepower to overwhelm the English. However, the English ships were able to avoid the brunt of the Spanish firepower, darting in and out of range, inflicting damage, and then retreating. The English ships were faster and more agile, using their speed to launch attacks and evade the more sluggish Spanish vessels. As the battle raged on, the Armada was forced to retreat, suffering losses to both its ships and morale. But this was only the beginning. The English navy, though unable to destroy the entire Armada in this first engagement, inflicted enough damage to keep the Spanish fleet on the defensive. The Spanish Armada, instead of pursuing its planned invasion, found itself trying to protect its ships and regroup. On August 6, the English Navy launched a daring attack. They used fireships, vessels set ablaze, and sent into the heart of the Spanish fleet at night in a bid to scatter the armada and create chaos. The fireships caused panic among the Spanish sailors, many of whom were unfamiliar with such tactics. The Spanish fleet, unable to form its usual battle lines, was thrown into disarray. Several ships were forced to cut their anchors and flee, while others were burned or sunk in the confusion. This was a blow to the armada, as its strategy depended on maintaining order and cohesion. The fireship attack threw the armada into disarray, and the English, exploiting the chaos, took advantage of the opportunity to strike. Despite these setbacks, the armada's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, sought to regroup. He decided to sail northward, to link up with the Spanish forces in the Netherlands, hoping that the combined strength of the fleet and the land forces would allow him to complete the mission. But this decision would prove to be disastrous. The English Navy followed closely, preventing the Spanish from regaining control over their original course. The Spanish ships were further battered by storms as they sailed north, and their morale continued to plummet. The turning point in the conflict came with the arrival of a ferocious storm, often referred to as the Protestant wind, which struck the armada as it attempted to sail around the northern tip of Scotland and head back home. This storm, which lasted for several days, scattered the Spanish fleet and caused further damage to the ships. The storm was a devastating blow to the already weakened armada, and many of the fleet's ships were destroyed or severely damaged. The sailors, who had already suffered from months of exhaustion and anxiety, were now facing an uncontrollable force of nature. By the time the storm subsided, the Spanish fleet was in full retreat. Of the 130 ships that had set sail in May, only around half managed to return to Spain. Many of the ships had been destroyed in battle or by the storm, while others had been forced to abandon their mission. The loss of men, ships and supplies was devastating, and the once mighty armada had been effectively neutralized. The failure of the Spanish armada was a momentous event in European history. It marked the beginning of the end for Spanish dominance in Europe, and signaled the rise of England as a major naval power. The defeat also had profound political and religious implications. For Queen Elizabeth I and Protestant England, the victory was a symbolic triumph, confirming their ability to defy Catholic power and resist foreign domination. It solidified England's role as a key player in European politics, and helped foster a sense of national pride and identity. On the other hand, the defeat was a major blow to King Philip II of Spain. Despite the immense resources he had poured into the campaign, the failure of the Armada marked the limits of Spanish power in the late 16th century. It also weakened Philip's ability to assert Catholic dominance in Europe, as Protestantism continued to spread, and England remained a staunch Protestant stronghold. But beyond the political and military consequences, the failure of the Spanish Armada also highlighted the unpredictable nature of war, where factors like geography, weather, and tactics could all determine the outcome. It also demonstrated the importance of adaptability in military strategy, something the Spanish, with their rigid approach to naval warfare, struggled to maintain against the flexible and dynamic English forces. And while the defeat was a moment of national triumph for England, it did not mark the end of tensions between the two powers. Conflicts between Spain and England would continue for years, though the threat of a large-scale invasion had been decisively eliminated. Over time, Spain's decline in naval power opened the door for English naval supremacy, setting the stage for the expansion of the British Empire in the centuries to come. What did the defeat of the Spanish Armada mean for the larger power dynamics of Europe? Could Spain ever fully recover from such a monumental failure? And how did the defeat shape future military and naval tactics? Was this event truly the turning point in the rise of English power on the world stage? Or were there other factors at play that contributed to England's eventual dominance? The long-term consequences of the Spanish Armada's failure. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 stands as one of the most decisive and symbolic moments in European history. While its immediate impact was felt most sharply by Spain and England, the long-term consequences reverberated across the globe, influencing the balance of power in Europe, the course of colonial expansion, and the very nature of naval warfare. The failure of the Armada marked the decline of Spain's dominance in the 16th century, and ushered in a new era of English supremacy at sea. while also setting the stage for future conflicts and power shifts in the centuries that followed. In Spain, the defeat was a devastating blow to both the monarchy and the national psyche. King Philip II had poured vast resources into the preparation of the Armada, mobilizing one of the largest fleets ever assembled at the time. He saw the mission not just as a military campaign but as a religious crusade to restore Catholicism in England and strike a blow against Protestantism. The failure of the Armada, particularly after such a significant investment, was a humiliation that undermined his authority and damaged his reputation. The loss also revealed the vulnerabilities of Spain's military strategies, which had been largely based on traditional methods of warfare that were less adaptable to the fast-moving, highly maneuverable English fleet. Despite the setback, Spain's global empire was not immediately jeopardized. Philip II continued to rule Spain and its overseas territories, including the riches flowing from the Americas. However, the defeat did mark the beginning of Spain's gradual decline as a dominant European power. Over the next few decades, Spain would face internal strife, including financial crises, exacerbated by its endless wars and the immense cost of maintaining its empire. The loss of the Armada also contributed to Spain's diminishing influence in European politics, particularly as other powers, like France and England, began to rise in prominence. For England, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was a triumph that solidified Queen Elizabeth I's rule and boosted national morale. The victory became a symbol of England's strength and resilience against foreign power. Elizabeth's leadership during the crisis not only reinforced her authority at home, but also enhanced her standing across Europe, where she was now seen as a formidable monarch. The defeat of the Armada elevated England's status as a rising naval power, and the English navy, which had been small and relatively weak in comparison to Spain's, began to grow in influence. The victory also had significant consequences for England's global ambition. The defeat of the Armada opened a door for English maritime exploration and expansion. With Spain's dominance on the seas broken, England became more active in overseas trade, piracy, and colonization. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake, who had harassed Spanish ships before the Armada, were now emboldened and continued their raids on Spanish treasure fleets, undermining Spain's economic power. These activities eventually laid the groundwork for the British Empire's vast overseas colonial holdings, particularly in the Americas, India, and parts of Africa. The impact of the Armada's failure on European geopolitics was not limited to England and Spain. The defeat weakened Catholicism's position in Europe and further cemented Protestantism's hold in England. Elizabeth I's refusal to marry Philip II, her steadfast rejection of Spanish dominance, and her success in repelling the Armada bolstered Protestant Europe's resistance to Catholic rule. Over the next few decades, England would play a significant role in supporting Protestant causes, particularly in the Netherlands, where the Spanish Inquisition had caused widespread strife. The defeat of the Armada helped to foster a sense of unity among Protestant nations in the face of Catholic aggression, leading to increased alliances between England, the Netherlands, and other Protestant countries. On the other hand, Spain's failure to conquer England prevented the full restoration of Catholicism in Britain and the return of the English throne to a Catholic monarch. This was a crucial moment in the ongoing religious conflicts that were tearing Europe apart during the 16th century. The struggle between Catholic and Protestant forces had already led to wars and tensions across the continent, and the defeat of the Armada only deepened this divide. The failure of Philip II's mission to subjugate England ensured that Protestantism would remain firmly entrenched in Britain, which had long-lasting implications for religious and political developments in the region. For the larger European balance of power, the defeat of the Armada marked a significant shift. Spain's fall from its zenith as the world's most powerful empire in the late 16th century opened up the possibility for other European powers to assert themselves more boldly. France, which had been embroiled in internal conflicts such as the French Wars of Religion, was in a position to strengthen its influence, and in the coming decades, it would rise to challenge Spain's dominance. In the 17th century, the Habsburgs' power would diminish as France and England became key players in shaping the European political order. The Spanish Armada also had lasting effects on the development of naval warfare. The defeat underscored the importance of speed, maneuverability, and coordination in naval battles. The English Navy's success was in part due to its ability to use smaller, faster ships, which could engage the enemy while avoiding the heavy broadsides of larger ships. The use of fire ships as a tactical innovation during the battle further demonstrated the creative use of resources in warfare. These lessons would be passed on to future generations, shaping naval strategies well into the modern era. While the failure of the Armada was a significant military defeat for Spain, it also highlighted the growing importance of emerging technologies and innovations in warfare. The success of the English Navy, bolstered by faster, more maneuverable ships, marked the dawn of a new era in naval technology. The Spanish, with their heavier and slower ships, found themselves at a disadvantage in this new style of warfare, which would be echoed in future conflicts between European powers. Finally, the failure of the Armada and the consequences that followed helped to solidify the emerging power dynamics of the late 16th century. England's rise as a maritime power, the shift in religious tensions, and the decline of Spanish influence were all part of the broader transformation that would shape the future of Europe. The defeat also illustrated the unpredictable nature of history, where a single moment, the failed invasion of England, could alter the course of events for centuries to come. In retrospect, the Spanish Armada represents not only the hubris of a powerful empire overestimating its own invincibility, but also the resilience of a nation determined to preserve its sovereignty and belief. The defeat of the Armada was a pivotal moment that reshaped the geopolitics of Europe, the future of maritime power, and the course of religious conflict. It stands as a reminder that the tides of history can change with remarkable speed, often based on a combination of strategy, circumstance, and unexpected challenges. As we reflect on the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the question remains: how much of history is shaped by moments of chance, and how much by human agency? What could have happened if the Armada had succeeded, and how would the world be different if Spain had reasserted Catholic rule over England? The answers to these questions remain speculative, but the consequences of the Armada's defeat are undeniable, reshaping Europe's political and religious landscape for centuries to come. The mystery of the Roanoke colony, the lost settlement. The first attempts at colonization. In the late 16th century, England was eager to establish its presence in the New World, a land teeming with promise and riches. The Americas, still largely unexplored by Europeans, represented the potential for wealth through trade, natural resources, and territorial expansion. However, England's initial attempts at establishing colonies were fraught with challenges, and none more mysterious than the ill-fated settlement at Roanoke Island. The story of Roanoke begins with Sir Walter Raleigh, a nobleman and explorer who sought to establish an English colony in North America. In 1584, Raleigh received a charter from Queen Elizabeth I to establish a colony in the New World. The aim was clear: secure England's claim to territory, promote trade, and challenge Spain's dominance in the Americas, particularly its control over vast territories in Central and South America. Raleigh's vision was not just about settling the land, but about creating a lasting presence that would help expand English influence. In 1585, the first group of colonists sailed to the Americas, landing on Roanoke Island, laid off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The colonists, however, faced immediate challenges. While the island provided a strategic location for trade, the settlers struggled with food shortages, poor relations with local indigenous tribes, and a lack of support from England. The colony was ill-prepared to sustain itself. The colonists had expected assistance from England, but this was not forthcoming, as resources were limited and the English crown was preoccupied with its other priorities, including conflicts with Spain and internal issues. The Roanoke colony's initial years were fraught with hardships. As tensions with the local Native American tribes escalated, the settlers grew increasingly dependent on supplies sent from England. However, this assistance was not always timely, and the colony's struggle to survive was compounded by the distant relationship with Raleigh and the English authorities. Raleigh sent another group of settlers in 1587, including families with the hope of creating a permanent English settlement. However, just as the second group arrived, England's conflict with Spain reached a boiling point, with the Spanish Armada looming in 1588. The priority shifted, and England found itself embroiled in war. Raleigh's plans for the colony were placed on hold, and the settlers were left isolated and vulnerable on Roanoke Island. In 1587, John White, the governor of the colony, sailed back to England to procure supplies. His mission was urgent, as the settlers were running out of resources and food. What happened next remains one of history's great mysteries. White, along with other ships and supplies, left Roanoke Island, intending to return in a few months. However, due to the conflict with Spain and the ongoing war with the Spanish Armada, White's return to Roanoke was delayed for 3 years. When he finally returned to the island in 1590, he found the colony completely deserted. The mystery of Roanoke's disappearance begins with this eerie moment. White found no trace of the settlers he had left behind. The only clue to their fate was the word Croatoan carved into a post and the letters Skoro etched into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, and it seemed to suggest that the settlers had moved there. However, when White attempted to investigate, the weather turned hostile, and he was unable to search further. With no answers, and the colony seemingly abandoned, White had no choice but to return to England. What happened to the settlers of Roanoke remains a mystery to this day. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony sparked curiosity and speculation. Over the centuries, many theories have been proposed, but no definitive answer has been found. Some believe that the settlers were killed by Native Americans, either through conflict or disease, while others suggest that they simply assimilated with nearby tribes. The idea that the settlers integrated with local indigenous groups is one of the most widely accepted theories, particularly because of later reports of Native American tribes with European features and customs. Another theory is that the settlers, facing starvation, attempted to flee to other areas but were lost or scattered in the wilderness. What happened to the colonists at Roanoke remains one of the most enduring mysteries of early American history. Was the colony a failed attempt that ended in disaster, or did the settlers somehow manage to survive, integrating into local communities and leaving behind only vague remnants of their existence? What were the real circumstances of their disappearance, and why were they never found? The Roanoke colony was not England's first attempt at establishing a permanent settlement in the New World, but it remains the most famous and perplexing. The story of Roanoke is one of loss, survival, and unanswered questions. It is a tale of ambitious plans that were thwarted by forces beyond the colonists' control, such as weather, political instability, and limited resources. Yet, it is also a story that captures the spirit of the age, the pursuit of new frontiers and the hope that new lands would provide opportunity, wealth, and a future. Theories and speculations about the fate of the Roanoke settlers. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony in 1590 continues to haunt historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts of historical mysteries. For over 4 centuries, the fate of the settlers has sparked theories, speculations, and a fascination with what might have happened to them. The fact that no definitive answer has emerged only adds to the intrigue surrounding the lost colony. After John White's failed return to Roanoke in 1590, no one ever saw or heard from the colonists again. The cryptic message Croatoan carved into a post was the only tangible clue left behind. Yet, despite numerous expeditions and searches, no evidence was found to explain what had happened to the settlers. This lack of evidence led to a range of theories that have evolved over the centuries. Theories of conflict with Native Americans. One of the earliest theories suggested that the settlers had been killed or captured by hostile Native American tribes. Relations between the English colonists and the indigenous people had been tense, as the settlers initially relied on Native Americans for food and supplies. As time went on, however, the settlers became more independent, and conflicts arose. The local tribes, particularly the Powhatan Confederacy, may have seen the English as a threat to their way of life, and some believe that the settlers were attacked and killed as a result. This theory was bolstered by reports from later English expeditions to Virginia, which claimed that they found signs of violence, including bodies of settlers, or heard stories from local tribes of Englishmen being killed. However, these accounts were often vague, and no direct evidence of such an attack was ever discovered at the Roanoke site. Furthermore, the carved word Croatoan might suggest that the settlers were not killed, but rather that they had moved to a nearby tribe in a more peaceful manner. Integration with native tribes. Another prominent theory is that the settlers of Roanoke were not wiped out by violence, but instead integrated with local Native American tribes. The carving of the word Croatoan was interpreted by some as a clue that the colonists had gone to live with the Croatoan tribe, an island-dwelling group south of Roanoke. But this theory was given more weight by the fact that the word Croatoan was written in the style of the English settlers. suggesting that they had left it behind themselves. In the years that followed the disappearance, reports surfaced that Native American tribes in the region had people with European features, such as lighter skin, blue eyes, and even some European-style clothing. This has led some to speculate that the Roanoke settlers may have been absorbed into these tribes, either by choice or out of necessity. These interactions were not uncommon in early American history, as European settlers and Native Americans often formed alliances or intermarried. Evidence of such integration, however, is sparse and remains largely anecdotal. No physical evidence, such as European tools or remains, has been definitively linked to the Roanoke settlers in the Native American communities. Still, this theory remains one of the more plausible explanations for the colony's disappearance, given the lack of other clear evidence: disease and starvation. Another theory posits that the settlers of Roanoke fell victim to disease or starvation, unable to survive the harsh conditions of the New World without proper supplies and reinforced. The settlers had struggled with food shortages and harsh winters, and it is possible that their situation grew increasingly dire in the years that White was away. Without a steady supply of food and faced with the difficulties of life on an unfamiliar island, the settlers might have succumbed to disease or starvation. This would explain the lack of bodies found upon White's return. If the settlers died in such a manner, their bodies may have been scavenged by animals, or the survivors may have buried them hastily. There is evidence that the settlers had not prepared sufficiently for the challenges of settling in the New World. The colony was poorly provisioned, and the English government had sent insufficient supplies, assuming that the settlers would be able to live off the land. This oversight, combined with the lack of reinforcement after White's departure, may have led to the settlers' eventual demise. The lost colony and miscommunication. Another theory revolves around the possibility of a simple misunderstanding. When John White arrived in 1590 and found the colony deserted, he may have misinterpreted the situation. The colonists may have left the island, as the word Croatoan suggested, but perhaps they were merely relocating to a more secure location due to the hardships they faced on Roanoke Island. White may have been unable to search for them due to weather conditions, or the inability to make contact with the local tribes. It's possible that, in his haste to return to England, White didn't fully understand that the colonists had not been wiped out, but instead had relocated in the hopes of survival. This theory suggests that the settlers might have moved to the nearby Croatoan Island, or another location, only for circumstances to prevent White from finding them. Had White been able to stay longer or investigate further, the mystery might have been solved sooner. In this case, the lost colony might not have been lost at all, but simply displaced. The Spanish intervention theory. A more dramatic theory involves the Spanish, who were increasingly involved in conflicts with England during this period. Some speculate that the Spanish, upon learning of the English colony in North America, might have taken matters into their own hands. Given the ongoing conflict between Catholic Spain and Protestant England, it is possible that the Spanish launched an expedition to destroy the colony, taking the settlers captive or killing them. This theory is based on the idea that Spain wanted to eliminate English presence in the Americas, particularly as Spain had already established its own colonies in the region and viewed England as a threat to its imperial ambitions. However, this theory has little evidence to support it. While there was conflict between Spain and England during the period, there is no direct evidence linking the Spanish to the disappearance of the Roanoke settlers. The Spanish were aware of English colonial efforts, but focused primarily on their own holdings in the Caribbean and South America, and they had little incentive to act against a small, struggling colony like Roanoke. The role of John White's return. John White's return to England and subsequent absence from Roanoke played a pivotal role in the mystery of the lost colony. The extended delay in White's return, 3 years instead of a few months, left the settlers in a precarious position, and when White finally returned, the colony was gone. The lack of direct contact with England in those crucial years meant that the settlers had no opportunity to report their progress or request further assistance. The failure to send reinforcements or provisions in a timely manner contributed to the situation's escalation. The mystery of what happened to the Roanoke colonists remains unsolved to this day. Archaeological efforts to uncover any physical evidence have been ongoing, and some believe that new technologies or discoveries could eventually provide an answer. But, for now, the fate of the lost colony remains one of the greatest historical enigmas of early American history. What would have happened if John White had returned earlier? Could the settlers have survived and created a permanent English presence in the New World? And more intriguingly, if they did integrate with local tribes, what was their fate after they became part of a different cultural group? And why did no lasting record of their survival emerge? The legacy of Roanoke and its influence on American history. The mystery of the Roanoke colony may never be definitively solved, but the story of its disappearance has had a lasting impact on the history of America, influencing the way later English colonies were established and shaped. While the fate of the settlers remains one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles, the Roanoke experience was instrumental in influencing future exploration, colonization, and the understanding of the New World. Roanoke's influence on later English colonization. The failure of Roanoke provided invaluable lessons for future English colonization efforts, particularly for the Virginia colony, and the later success of Jamestown, which was established in Jamestown, located in Virginia, was England's first permanent colony in the New World, and its settlement and survival benefited from the mistakes made at Roanoke. One key lesson was the importance of preparation and reliable supply line. The settlers at Roanoke were poorly equipped to handle the challenges of establishing a colony in the unfamiliar wilderness of North America. They lacked adequate supplies, including food, tools, and weapons, and their isolation made them vulnerable to both internal and external threat. When the English authorities failed to send timely reinforcements, the settlers were left without the resources needed to sustain themselves, contributing to their demise. By contrast, Jamestown's colonists were better prepared, and although they faced significant challenges, they benefited from improved supply lines and better planning. Another lesson from Roanoke was the need for stronger relations with Native American tribes. The settlers at Roanoke had initially relied on the goodwill of the indigenous people, but later found themselves in conflict with them, exacerbating their difficulties. In Jamestown, the colonists initially faced hostilities with the Powhatan Confederacy, but over time they negotiated a fragile peace that allowed them to survive. While the settlers still faced challenges in their relations with Native Americans, the failure of Roanoke demonstrated the importance of establishing diplomatic relationships and securing assistance from local tribes. Roanoke's failure also reinforced the need for continued English commitment to colonial ventures. The Roanoke settlers had been abandoned by the English crown for 3 years, leaving them to fend for themselves. By contrast, the establishment of Jamestown saw greater English commitment, including the establishment of a more organized governing system, the appointment of more experienced leadership, and more consistent support from England. While Jamestown was not without its own hardships, such as the starving time of 1609–1610, the colony ultimately survived and grew, leading to the eventual establishment of other English colonies along the eastern seaboard. Roanoke's cultural and symbolic legacy, beyond its direct influence on later colonial efforts, the story of Roanoke has become an enduring symbol of both failure and mystery in American history. The fate of the lost colony has been romanticized and mythologized in literature, folklore, and popular culture. The word Croatoan, carved into a post by the missing colonists, has been the subject of much speculation and intrigue, leading to theories about the settlers' assimilation into Native American tribes, their demise, or even the possibility of secret survival in hidden communities. In many ways, the mystery of Roanoke captures the essence of the challenges faced by early American colonists. It represents the unknown, an attempt to conquer a new world that was filled with both opportunity and danger. The story has remained alive in the American imagination, symbolizing the resilience of early settlers and the mysteries of the New World. The colony's disappearance also represents the complexities of European colonialism. The Roanoke settlers were, after all, part of a much larger global phenomenon of European powers competing for control of new territories, resources, and influence. The colony's failure, and the lack of evidence explaining it, stands as a reminder of how fragile early European attempts to settle and dominate the Americas truly were. Archaeological and scholarly pursuits. The legacy of Roanoke has also influenced modern archaeology and historical research. In recent decades, archaeologists have worked to uncover the remnants of the Roanoke colony, hoping to find new evidence that could shed light on its fate. Numerous digs have been conducted on Roanoke Island and in the surrounding region, focusing on areas where the colony was believed to have been located. While some artifacts have been uncovered, such as tools, pottery, and remnants of English-style construction, nothing has conclusively proven what happened to the colonists. In addition to the physical evidence, ongoing research into primary sources, including John White's accounts and the records of subsequent English expeditions, continues to yield new interpretations. Scholars debate the meaning of the carved word Croatoan and its implications, while others examine the political, economic, and social factors that influence the failure of Roanoke. These investigations keep the mystery alive and continue to fuel speculation about what really happened to the lost colonists. The Roanoke mystery also shaped the way historians view early American colonialism. The failure of Roanoke has been studied as an example of how European settlers often underestimated the challenges of colonizing the New World, from the complexity of indigenous relations to the harsh environmental conditions. The lessons learned from Roanoke were integral to the eventual success of later colonies, even as it remains a poignant symbol of the difficulties early settlers faced. The mystery's place in American identity. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony occupies an iconic space in American cultural memory, particularly in relation to themes of exploration, survival, and the unknown. For centuries, Roanoke has been used as a metaphor for the pioneering spirit of America. Even though its story was one of failure, the idea of people traveling into uncharted territories hoping to build something new is a foundational narrative of the American experience, and Roanoke stands as an early and mysterious chapter in that story. In modern times, the Roanoke colony has inspired a variety of cultural works, including books, movies, documentaries, and even television series. It remains one of the most enduring historical mysteries, often used to reflect broader themes of American identity, particularly the tension between ambition and failure, hope and uncertainty, and the quest to understand and conquer the unknown. The lost colony has become a symbolic representation of the many early challenges of American settlement and expansion, reflecting both the successes and the struggles that would define the history of the New World. The story of Roanoke, in the end, represents the complex interplay of history and myth. While the true fate of the settlers remains unknown, the mystery itself has had a lasting impact on American culture and the collective memory of the early colonial experience. Roanoke serves as a reminder of the risks and uncertainties that came with the first attempts to settle the New World, and it is a testament to the enduring allure of history's unsolved enigmas. The enduring questions. The mystery of Roanoke continues to raise questions. Could the settlers have survived and integrated with nearby tribes? Did they perish from disease, starvation, or conflict? Was there a more dramatic explanation, such as a Spanish intervention or a natural disaster, that led to their disappearance? These questions may never be answered, but the legacy of Roanoke remains firmly embedded in the history of early American settlement. It stands as a testament to the complexities and uncertainties faced by those who sought to create new worlds in an unknown land.